The morning sea lay gray and patient, the surface calm but heavy with an unspoken weight, a mirror of metal and sky that promised routine yet concealed an ancient hunger beneath. From the pier, the submarine slipped away, engines churning with confident rhythm, her hull gleaming like oiled armor, the name Squalus painted crisp against the salt, damp air. She moved eastward into deeper water, a dark bullet of American engineering, 40 officers and men sealed inside a capsule of steel that would soon test every law of pressure and hope. Orders were clipped, precise, the way naval mornings always began, hatches dog-tight, gauges checked, the diving officer reading out numbers that meant everything and nothing to the men who trusted those dials more than their own pulse. The ballast tanks hissed, and the great body began to sink, air replaced by water, a deliberate surrender to gravity. Above, gulls cried and disappeared, and sunlight turned from white to gold to green to nothing at all. Within minutes, the Squalus passed 100 feet, then 150, and the vibrations changed pitch, a hollow resonance that made every rivet seem to breathe. In the control room, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of oil and human breath, and conversation shrank to murmurs. Each man felt the pressure creeping in, pressing against eardrums, against metal, against thought. They had done this dive a dozen times, but today the ocean seemed too quiet, too still, as if waiting for the first mistake. Down at 200 feet, the trim was perfect, depth steady. The captain allowed himself a small nod to the diving officer. Then a hiss, not the normal exhale of valves, but a sharper whisper, the sound of a wound opening. A flash of confusion crossed the chief's face. A valve indicator trembled, slipped, and slammed to zero. In the engine room, a geyser of seawater erupted through a failed main air induction valve, cold and merciless, flooding faster than human hands could respond. In seconds, the aft compartments turned into chaos. Steam, shouts, metal hammering metal as watertight doors slammed shut. The men forward felt the tremor but didn't yet know the source. They only heard the unnatural roar coming from behind the steel bulkheads, the sound of the ocean forcing its way in. The captain barked orders, "Blow main ballast," and the engineer twisted the levers, but the gauges danced wildly and the submarine kept dropping. Air hissed out of ruptured lines, lights flickered, and a sudden silence followed that was worse than any noise. The ship hit bottom at 240 feet with a shudder that threw men against consoles. For a moment, all was still. Then came the reality. No ascent, no response from surface, and the bow listing 5 degrees to starboard. Water dripped from the overhead, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat counting down. The captain's voice was calm when he spoke, the calm of a man who has already seen death approach and refuses to flinch. "Seal all compartments. Conserve air." Men moved mechanically, their training holding them together even as the realization spread they were trapped on the ocean floor. Electric lights dimmed to emergency red, painting faces in ghostly hues. In that glow, every expression looked already half drowned. Condensation gathered on steel bulkheads, forming droplets that slid downward like tiny tears. The temperature dropped, and breath turned visible. Somewhere aft, someone was still pounding, then nothing but the hum of batteries and the slow creak of hull plates adjusting to pressure. Above them, 200 feet of seawater pressed down with the weight of a mountain, and beyond that, on the surface, no one yet knew they were gone. Minutes stretched into an hour. The captain signaled for the messenger buoy, a steel sphere carrying a telephone line, to be released. The mechanism jammed once, twice, before finally shooting upward through the dark column. The line uncoiled behind it, the only thread connecting life below to the world above. Inside the Squalus, the men gathered near the forward compartments, the only sections dry and intact. 33 of them remained alive. They whispered to each other in short sentences, conserving oxygen, every breath a subtraction. Some watched the pressure gauge, others stared at the floor where thin lines of water traced patterns around their boots. The ocean, vast and indifferent, groaned against the hull, a living thing testing its prize. Somewhere inside that iron coffin, a light flickered. Hope, fragile and mechanical, burning on stored battery current. The captain ordered all unnecessary systems shut down, plunging them into semi-darkness, then dictated a message to the surface. Submarine disabled. Crew alive forward. Air limited. Request immediate assistance. The words clang through the line like prayers. On the surface, the buoy bobbed among the waves unnoticed for hours, until a patrol craft spotted the small red float and hauled it aboard. A radio operator read the message aloud, and the harbor awoke to alarm. The rescue ships began to form, and somewhere ashore a man named Charles Swede Momsen was called. But down below, the men could not know that yet. All they knew was the sound of their own breathing, the metallic echo of survival measured in cubic feet of air. The chief petty officer moved among them, checking faces, forcing calm where panic tried to bloom. Someone coughed, another prayed under his breath. The captain kept his eyes on the depth gauge as if by watching it he could will the ocean to retreat. Hours passed. Moisture condensed into small puddles on the deck. They rationed water and hope alike. In the quiet, the hull groaned again, a deep, resonant complaint that rolled through the submarine like thunder. Each man froze, waiting for the sound to fade. When it did, they exhaled together, the release of air sounding almost like a sigh from the sea itself. Above, clouds thickened and the first rescue vessels churned towards the coordinates, their wakes spreading like the first lines of a battle map. The contest had begun, man versus pressure, steel versus time. Beneath those waves, the Squalus lay still, her bow pointing slightly upward, a tomb that refused to close, a question waiting for an answer from the world above.
Above the gray Atlantic, morning slid into noon, and the sea had already begun to roll heavier, darkening under a lid of gathering cloud. The buoy that carried the Squalus's message rocked and dipped, its thin cable stretching taut with each wave, the words inside its small metal shell waiting for a human ear. When the lookout on the surface vessel Falcon sighted it, there was only the faint clink of chain and the slap of water against steel. They brought it aboard, wiped the salt from the embossed letters, unscrewed the cap, and found the paper damp but legible. Submarine disabled, crew alive forward, air limited, request immediate assistance. The words were at once calm and desperate, precise and pleading. Within minutes, radio sparked to life. In command posts ashore, phones rang in sequence. Orders flew through headsets and code pads, summoning every diver, engineer, and piece of salvage equipment that could move. Engines coughed awake on harbor tugs. The Falcon signaled the Sculpin to circle the area and drop marker buoys. A storm front was coming, but there was no time to wait for weather to clear. The ocean floor was already tightening its grip. Every hour mattered. On the Falcon's bridge, the rescue commander traced coordinates on a chart, the pencil trembling slightly as the ship pitched. He looked out through salt-smeared glass at the swell that marked where the submarine lay. 240 feet, he murmured. Cold water, mud bottom. To any ordinary diver, that depth was a death sentence, but to the Navy's experimental rescue crew, it was a challenge measured in air pressure and endurance. The call went out for Momsen's team. In a small office on shore, Charles Swede Momsen bent over his desk when the message arrived, his pipe cooling between his fingers. The words were brief, clinical. Squalus sunk, crew alive, rescue required immediately. He stared at them for only a second before moving. There was no time for hesitation, no satisfaction that the impossible device he had fought to build would finally be tested. Only motion. Within an hour, he was aboard a seaplane bound for Portsmouth, map spread across his knees, mind already dividing the situation into tasks: locate, attach, retrieve. On the surface, the rescue ships dropped anchor. The water below them was an ink-black world of silence. Soundings confirmed the wreck, a metallic echo that came back slow and solid. "We have her," the sonar operator said, and everyone on deck paused, listening to that invisible heartbeat pulsing beneath them. They rigged the downhaul cable, a lifeline that would connect surface to seabed, and began lowering a marker. The wind picked up, flinging spray across the men's faces. The ocean, as if sensing intrusion, answered with higher swells. Below, the Squalus remained motionless, her steel skin dimmed to green shadow. Inside, the trapped men heard the faint scrape of something above, maybe the marker, maybe imagination, and for the first time in hours, a ripple of hope moved among them. The captain wrote another message, sealing it in a watertight container. Alive, air fouled but sufficient, battery low. It rose through the column, found the surface, and was hauled in like a note from the underworld. The word spread across the deck of the Falcon and into the radios again. Momsen's aircraft touched town hours later. He stepped onto the dock into wind that smelled of oil and salt. Reporters shouted questions he ignored. He was thinking only of steel thicknesses, oxygen mixtures, and the rescue chamber that waited in crates nearby. It had never been used in a real emergency. He ran his hand along the curved hull of the chamber, feeling the cold metal vibrate faintly with the thrum of the sea. "She'll hold," he said to no one in particular, and the divers around him nodded. Floodlights blazed as cranes swung the heavy cylinder into position. Cables snaked across the deck like veins. The rescue had become a machine of men and iron, all centered on one point beneath them, where 33 breaths ticked away. Night approached, but no one left their station. The ocean was a sheet of gunmetal under the fading light. Orders came clipped, measured, each one carrying the edge of fear wrapped in professionalism. The first divers went down to attach guidelines to the wreck. They vanished into the black water, their bubbles rising like faint silver threads. Over the radio, the surface crew heard their breathing, slow and heavy. Visibility 2 feet. Mud bottom. Found the hull. The voice cracked with static. Then faintly, "She's upright." Cheers erupted on deck. That small fact, that the Squalus had settled level, meant the chamber might seal properly. Above, lightning flickered on the horizon. The sea began to heave. The wind snapped at flags and cables, but no one looked up. All eyes stayed on the depth gauges and the taut lines that disappeared into the water. Hours dragged. Coffee grew cold, hands numbed, but the rhythm continued. Divers surfaced gasping, faces pale, replaced by others before they could speak. In the control tent, Momsen studied readings, calculating descent rates, adjusting ballast on paper. He could feel the pressure through the soles of his boots, the immense weight of water waiting to crush any mistake. He thought of the men below, of their silence, their measured breaths. In that isolation, they were both captives and comrades in a battle without gunfire, fighting an enemy that had no shape but time. Then, through the headsets, a voice. "Line secure on forward hatch, ready for chamber." The words dropped like a spark into dry tinder. Deck crews moved instantly, guiding the heavy rescue chamber over the side. It splashed into the dark with a hollow boom, water closing around it. Cables tightened, winches whined. The descent began, slow and steady, every foot a negotiation with gravity. In the glow of the deck lamps, men watched the dials, lips moving silently, each of them imagining what it must be like at 200 feet below, where light could not follow. The chamber sank, the cable unspooling into blackness. The ocean closed over everything, indifferent, ancient, swallowing men and machines alike, but inside that indifference, human resolve burned like a stubborn flame. On the Squalus, a faint metallic thud echoed through the hull, distant, rhythmic, alien. The trapped men lifted their heads. Someone whispered, "They're coming." And above, as rain began to fall across the heaving deck of the Falcon, Momsen stood by the rail, water streaming from his coat, eyes fixed on the waves that hid the battlefield. The ocean had issued its challenge. The reply, at last, was descending.
The rain came harder as the night deepened, drumming against the deck like the ticking of an immense clock. The sea glowed faintly under the deck lights, a shifting field of green and gray that hid the rescue chamber's descent. Cables groaned with strain as winches paid out the line, foot by cautious foot, the steel hawser singing under tension. Every man on the Falcon leaned into the sound, hearing in that low vibration the bridge between life and death. The chamber, a dull metal cylinder with small round ports, was more than machinery now. It was a messenger descending into a realm that had swallowed its prey whole. Inside it, 2 divers crouched over valves and gauges, faces pale in the lantern light. They could feel the pressure mounting around them, could hear the faint creak of metal as the ocean pressed harder with each meter down. One of them, Chief Diver John Michalowski, kept his hand on the control lever, eyes never leaving the depth indicator. He had practiced this 100 times in calm water, but practice had no heartbeat. This descent did. Above, the voice of Momsen came through the speaking tube, low and deliberate. "Keep your trim steady, John. Remember, slow is alive." The reply came back calm. "Aye, sir. Passing 150. The ocean swallowed the words. Beyond the small windows of the chamber, there was nothing now but darkness, the kind of dark that erases distance. Light from the surface had vanished, only the glow of their instruments remained. Tiny bubbles drifted upward, vanishing into the black like sparks in smoke. The divers could feel temperature dropping through the steel skin. They were moving into cold that bit through rubber and cloth. Every minute stretched, measured by the turn of the depth dial and the hiss of compressed air adjusting buoyancy. At 220 feet, Mihailovsky felt the chamber sway. He steadied it with a touch on the control, then caught a glint through the port. A slant of metal, faint but unmistakable. "Visual on the sub," he said. Above, on the Falcon's deck, a cheer rose before the next wave slapped it down. "You're right over her, John. Keep coming," Momsen's voice urged. The chamber descended the last 20 feet like a diver lowering himself into memory. The outline of the Squalus emerged, her hull half buried in silt, bow slightly up, paint scraped to bare steel. No movement, no sound, but the endless whisper of the sea around her. Mihailovsky guided the chamber toward the forward escape hatch, a small circle of metal that looked absurdly delicate against the bulk of the submarine. He eased the chamber's skirt over the coaming until the two pieces of steel met. A faint jolt ran through the frame as they sealed together. He shut the ballast valves, checked pressure differentials, and keyed the line. "Contact made. We're locked." On deck, the announcement brought men to attention like a gun had fired. Momsen exhaled, shoulders slumping for the first time in hours. "Hold it there," he said into the tube. "We'll start the pressure equalization." In the chamber, valves hissed as the interior pressure increased, matching the trapped air inside the submarine. Metal groaned faintly, a duet of two hollow worlds learning to breathe together. Mihailovsky pressed his helmet to the port and saw faces below, blurred, pale, ghost-like, peering up through the small window in the hatch. One of them raised his hand, he raised his own in return, a gesture small enough to break the ocean's silence. They waited as pressure gauges steadied, then Mihailovsky reached for the release handle. "Ready to open," he said. "Proceed," came Momsen's reply, carried down the thin wire like a heartbeat. The diver twisted the handle, the hatch resisted, then moved with a dull crack, releasing a puff of stale, acrid air that filled the chamber with the scent of battery fumes and human endurance. A face appeared in the opening below, eyes wide, voice trembling with disbelief. "You came," he said, half statement, half prayer. Mihailovsky only nodded. "We're taking you home." They worked quickly. Space was tight, only room for 7 at a time. The survivors climbed up into the chamber, guided by hands that felt more like anchors than rescuers, heavy with purpose. Each man was checked for consciousness, seated, given an oxygen mask. The air inside was thick and sour. One of the rescued men wept silently, his shoulders shaking in the dim light. No one told him to stop. Above, the deck crew could see nothing. They had only the vibrations in the line, the coded tugs that told them how many had entered. The first code came, 7 aboard. Momsen gave the order to raise. Winches whined, the cable tightened, and the chamber began to rise, slow and smooth, its load of living cargo clinging to the hope that the line would hold. Every creak of metal was a threat. Every foot gained victory. At 100 feet, the strain increased as currents shifted. "Keep her centered," Momsen ordered. The winch operator nodded, sweat streaming down his face despite the cold. The sea threw spray over the bow, salt stinging eyes and lips. Men held their breath each time the cable jerked. Inside the chamber, silence thickened. The rescued crew sat motionless, eyes closed, as if afraid movement might break the fragile thread that connected them to the air above. Michalowski and his partner monitored gauges, whispering numbers to each other. The pressure dropped gradually. They could feel their ears pop, their joints ache. One man began to tremble uncontrollably, shock setting in. The diver wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, murmuring something meaningless but steady, the way one might talk to a child waking from a nightmare. At last, light appeared, a dull green that turned to gray, then to the violent white of surface floodlamps. The chamber broke the waves, water streaming from its sides. The deck crew roared as if victory had been declared. Cranes swung, cables clanked, and the chamber settled onto its cradle with a hollow thud. The hatch opened to cheers, and the first survivor stumbled out, eyes blinking against the light, face gray but alive. They carried him gently across the deck, wrapped him in blankets, pressed warm mugs into shaking hands. One by one, the others followed, and as each face emerged, a shout went up, merging with the wind until even the sea seemed to listen. Momsen stood back, watching, jaw tight. 7 lives, 7 names reclaimed from the ocean's ledger, but 33 had been waiting, and 26 still pressed against the dark below. He knew the next descent would be harder. The sea would not surrender easily, it never did. But for now there was a breath of triumph. The first contact had been made, the impossible proven possible. The men on deck laughed and shouted and cried all at once, their faces streaked with salt and rain. The chamber crew climbed out, blinking, drenched, and nodded silently to Momsen. There were no words big enough for what they had just done. Night closed around them again, the storm thickening, but the deck lights burned steady, halos of gold in the mist. Down below in the still hull of the Squalus, those who remained could hear faint thuds through the steel, the language of rescue. They knew now that the ocean was not the only force down there. Human hands were reaching through the pressure, refusing to let go. In that sound was hope, small but fierce, beating like a heart against the weight of the deep.
The deck of the Falcon had turned into a landscape of exhaustion and steel. Floodlights hissed in the rain, drawing halos in the spray that never quite reached the stars. The rescued 7 lay in makeshift bunks under tarps, their breathing shallow but steady, the color returning slowly to their faces. Around them the air smelled of salt, oil, and coffee. Yet no one spoke of rest. The chamber was already being checked, bolts retightened, seals inspected, oxygen tanks replaced. The ocean waited, restless, heavy, knowing the next descent would not be easier. Wind keened through rigging and wires like a warning voice, but the men barely heard it. They were deep inside the rhythm now, the cadence of work that had no margin for pause. Somewhere in that moving circle of light and noise, Momsen stood, collar up against the rain, clipboard clutched in one hand. His eyes traced the cable leading into the water, his mind already 200 feet down, rehearsing every motion that would have to be repeated in darkness. The first lift had gone right because luck had leaned their way. Luck, he knew, never lingered. When the order came, prepare to lower, it sounded more like a confession than a command. The chamber hung above the waves, dripping, gleaming faintly like some metallic seed born of human stubbornness. Inside, the same divers strapped in again, faces drawn but resolute. No one needed to be told what waited below. Cold, pressure, and the knowledge that anything could fail without reason. Momsen's voice came through the line, softer this time. "Same drill, John. We're taking more up tonight." Milahowski's reply was steady, but behind the calm there was fatigue, a tremor too small to hear through static. "Understood. Lower away." The chamber slipped into the sea with a hollow boom and began its descent. The cable unwound, hissing through pulleys. Wind pushed at the Falcon, making the winch operators fight to keep the line vertical. Down below, water pressure climbed with cruel precision. The divers could feel the weight settling on the hull, every inch of steel bending slightly under its load.
the glow from their instruments threw small circles of light that quivered with each movement. Their world had shrunk to a space no bigger than a closet, their window to the outside no wider than a dinner plate. The blackness beyond was alive with drifting silt, tiny particles moving like snow in an endless night. At 100 feet, the chamber rocked violently as a current caught it, spinning it off alignment. Milahowski grabbed the stabilizer handle, braced his boots, forced it back. "Easy," he muttered. The other diver adjusted ballast valves, letting air hiss into tanks to steady their fall. Above, the crew felt the shudder through the cable and froze. "You're swinging," Momsen said sharply. "Correct your drift." "Already on it," came the reply, clipped and tight. The chamber steadied, resumed its descent. The depth gauge needle crept down 180, 190, 200. The faint outline of the Squalus appeared again, spectral in the beam of the searchlight, her hull beaded with condensation, her conning tower draped in silt. No movement, only the silent weight of the sea pressing against her. The divers aligned the chamber over the escape hatch once more. The first docking had scraped the paint. They could see the scar like a reminder of how close the margin was. Milahowski eased the controls, nudging the chamber into place. Metal touched metal, and the faint tremor of impact ran through their boots. He keyed the line. Contact made, beginning equalization. The hiss of air filled the chamber, the sound thin but relentless. Gauges quivered as pressure equalized between the two trapped worlds. He peered through the port. Inside the submarine, he could see faces again, fewer this time, eyes wide but steadier. They had seen proof that the surface could reach them. Hope had taken shape. "Ready to open," Milahowski reported. "Proceed." The hatch swung inward, bringing with it the smell of human breath, stale and sour. Voices rose in greeting, disbelief edged with laughter. The divers moved quickly, guiding the next group into the chamber. One man hesitated, hand on the rim of the hatch. "The rest?" he asked. Milahowski met his eyes through the visor. "We'll come back," he said. The man nodded and climbed up. 6, 7, 8. Each motion rehearsed, each heartbeat counted. The hatch closed, the wheels spun, and they were sealed again in their small capsule of borrowed air. Above, the wind howled harder. The cable shuddered as waves lifted the Falcon and dropped her again. "Take her up," Momsen ordered, and the winches began to turn. The strain meter needle swung dangerously near the red. The men on deck tightened grips, boots braced against slippery steel. Spray slashed across faces. Salt water found every crack in clothing and burned the skin. The rescue chamber rose, inch by inch, swinging slightly in the current. Twice it snagged on unseen protrusions, the cable jerking like a live wire. Each time Milahowski adjusted ballast, each time the chamber steadied, climbing toward the dim promise of light. Inside, the rescued men sat silent, hands gripping knees, heads bowed. One man began to hum a tune under his breath, something tuneless and low. Another joined, then stopped when the chamber tilted suddenly. The sound of the cable above was like thunder transmitted through bone. The divers checked their gauges, whispering numbers. 200, 150. The air grew warmer, wetter, as pressure eased. At last, a faint green glow filtered through the port, the surface lamps shining down like stars distorted by water. They broke through into the storm, the chamber swinging violently in the wind before the cranes caught it. Deckhands rushed forward, hooking lines, guiding it onto the cradle. The hatch opened, steam and breath poured out in a cloud, and the rescued men blinked into the light, faces raw, eyes red-rimmed, but alive. Someone shouted, "8 more!" and a cheer rolled across the deck, swallowed immediately by the roar of the wind. Momsen reached out, steadying one man as he stumbled onto the deck. "Welcome back," he said simply. The sailor tried to answer, but could only manage a nod, tears mingling with rain on his cheeks. The others followed, each one lifted clear of the hatch, each breath of victory. When the chamber was emptied, the divers emerged last, pale ghosts against the blaze of lights. They looked up once toward the storm clouds tearing across the sky, then down again at the black water that still held 25 men. "We'll go again," Milahowski said. Momsen nodded. "After we check the lines." He turned away, voice cracking as he barked new orders. Hoses were coiled, air tanks swapped. instruments recalibrated. The rhythm of rescue continued, relentless, precise, like a drum beat in the dark. The wind grew wilder, driving sheets of rain across the deck. Waves struck the hull, sending shudders through steel and bone alike. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flickered, turning the sea white for a heartbeat, revealing the cable plunging straight down into eternity. The men glanced at it, then at one another, and went back to work. Above them, the storm raged. Below them, 33 souls had been reduced to 25, each breath burning faster than the last. Between those two infinities, human resolve built its bridge one dive at a time, refusing to break.
The wind hadn't stopped since dawn. It came in long, cold breaths from the east, carrying salt that stung eyes and turned the deck slick as ice. The Falcon pitched and rolled like an animal straining at a leash, her bow burying itself in the waves and rising again with a groan. Every bolt, every cable, every man aboard felt the stress. The ocean no longer looked like water, but a moving wall of gray muscle, heaving and breaking, alive with intent. On that deck, soaked to the skin, the rescue crew moved with the same stubborn rhythm they had learned from hours of repetition. Check gauges, tighten clamps, signal the winch, breathe. The chamber had already gone down twice. 14 men were alive who should have been dead. Yet the arithmetic of survival was unfinished. Somewhere below, the Squalus still held the rest in its iron lungs, and each hour the air inside grew thinner, more poisoned. No one said it, but everyone knew. Another descent was coming, storm or no storm. Momsen's voice was raw from shouting against the wind. "Secure the line! Check the drum bearings!" His words vanished into the noise, but hands obeyed anyway. They moved by gesture now, by instinct. The rescue chamber swung from its crane, dripping, the skin dented and scarred from the last lift. It looked smaller than before, as if the ocean had already claimed part of it. Mihailovsky stood inside tightening his helmet straps, eyes red, lips cracked. The other diver, exhausted but silent, gave a brief nod. The hatch clanged shut above them, and the world narrowed again to steel walls and the breathing of two men who had already spent too long in the dark. The signal came, "Lower away." At first the descent went smoothly. The winch paid out the cable in a steady rhythm, the chamber sliding beneath the surface with barely a splash. The sea closed over it like a door. On deck, the crew watched the gauges, each rotation of the drum a measure of faith. 200 feet of steel line spooled into the blackness, vibrating under tension. Then, just as the depth indicator passed 120, something changed. The vibration deepened, a strange shudder that crawled up through the deck plates. The operator frowned, hand on the lever. "Feels heavy," he said. Another foot, another groan, the drum slowed. Then, with a sudden metallic shriek, the line stopped altogether. The entire winch juddered once and froze. "Jam!" someone shouted. The word cut through the wind like a shot. Men sprang forward. Momsen was there in 2 strides, eyes scanning the gauges. "Hold the brake! Don't move it until we know where she is!" He bent over the indicator. "Depth, 130. They're mid-descent," he said quietly. "If we jerk that line, we'll snap it clean." Down below, Mihailovsky felt the lurch instantly. The chamber stopped so abruptly that both men slammed against the bulkhead. Tools rattled. A gauge popped loose, spinning to the deck. He steadied himself, grabbed the speaking tube. "Surface, we're stopped! Feels like a snag on the line!" Static answered, then Momsen's voice, distorted but steady. "Stay put, John. We've got a jam topside. Check your seals and wait for orders." "Understood," Mihailovsky said, although the air already felt thicker, more humid. They could feel the sway of the chamber as currents pressed against it, each movement tightening the invisible knot above. For long minutes, there was only the sound of their breathing and the creak of stressed steel. On the surface, the crew swarmed the winch. 2 men hammered at the casing with mallets, another crawled under the housing with a wrench, fingers numb and bleeding from the cold. The cable, wet with salt, had slipped its groove and wedged between drum and guide. They tried to lever it free, but the tension was monstrous. One wrong move and thousands of pounds of force would whip the line apart. Momsen crouched beside them, voice low but urgent. "We can't risk taking tension. Ease the load with the auxiliary brake, quarter turn only."
The operator nodded, jaw clenched. He turned the wheel. The line sang, the pitch rising, a metallic scream that made everyone flinch. For a heartbeat, it held, then shifted slightly. The jam loosened, but not enough. Sweat mixed with rain on every face. "Again," Momsen said. The man turned the wheel a fraction more. Another groan, another jolt. The cable moved, but now it began to fray where it rubbed the edge of the drum. Tiny threads of steel glittered in the light. One more twist, and it would shear. "Stop!" Momsen barked. "We'll try from below." He grabbed the voice line. "John, we've got partial movement. Can you add buoyancy, just enough to ease tension?" "Aye, sir," came the reply, thin through static. Inside the chamber, Mihailovsky opened the air valves. Compressed air hissed into ballast tanks, pushing back against gravity. The chamber rose an inch, maybe two, just enough to slacken the cable. On deck, the vibration changed pitch. "She's lighter!" someone shouted. The mechanic seized the moment, jammed a pry bar under the guide wheel and heaved. The cable slipped free with a dull clang. Men stumbled back as the line snapped into alignment, spraying rust flakes. "Jam cleared!" the cry went up. Half belief, half relief. Momsen gripped the railing, eyes on the depth gauge. "Easy now," he said. "Don't drop her. Take it slow." Below, the chamber rocked as the line moved again. Mihailovsky closed the valves, steadied the descent. "Feels smooth now," he reported. "Continuing down." The other diver let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was close. Too close," Mihailovsky answered. They said nothing else. The depth needle crawled past 150, 160. The dark outside thickened, full of unseen things brushing against the hull. They reached the Squalus again, the familiar silhouette rising out of the gloom like a wrecked cathedral. Mihailovsky guided the chamber into position over the forward hatch, but as he adjusted ballast, a faint tremor shivered through the frame. The jam had left scars on the cable. Every inch of it now carried danger. He eased the controls slower than ever, hands steady despite the cold that had begun to numb his fingers. When they locked onto the hatch, the relief was almost physical. "Contact made," he reported. Above, cheers broke through tired throats, then died quickly as another gust of wind slammed across the deck. No one trusted the ocean anymore. Inside the submarine, the trapped sailors gathered at the escape trunk, eyes fixed upward. They had heard the vibration, felt the shift of pressure. They knew their rescuers had returned, though they could not guess how close disaster had come. One man began to tap on the bulkhead with a wrench. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 3 more. In the chamber, the divers heard it faintly and smiled. "They're ready," the second diver said. "So are we," Mihailovsky answered. The equalization hissed. The hatch wheel turned. The air that rushed in carried the same sour tang of battery fumes, but now it smelled almost sweet compared to fear. The men below greeted them with exhausted grins. "You made it back," one said. "We weren't leaving you," Mihailovsky replied. The transfer began again, measured, disciplined. Each man lifted through the small circle of steel into safety. Above, the cable hummed under strain, but held. The chamber began its climb once more. 7 lives sealed inside, dragging their fragile hope up through 200 feet of hostile water. On the deck of the Falcon, Momsen watched the line inch upward, his knuckles white on the railing. Lightning flickered again, throwing brief silver across the sea. The storm was closer now, waves breaking over the bow. Yet the winch turned steady and slow, the line singing its one-note song. When the chamber finally broke the surface, the men on deck roared their approval into the wind. The hatch opened, and the rescued crew emerged, blinking, trembling, alive. Momsen helped the last man up, his own hands shaking. "Welcome topside," he said, voice nearly lost in the gale. Then for a moment all sound blurred into the rush of rain and the groan of steel. The cable that had jammed, the cable that had nearly snapped, hung between sky and sea, dripping, frayed, but unbroken. It was a thin thing, yet it had held 2 worlds together. The storm roared louder, but beneath it ran another sound, the quiet hum of men resetting equipment, preparing to go again. Because the job wasn't done. 25 souls still waited in the dark, and until the last one breathed air again, there would be no rest, no dawn, no victory. Only the endless argument between human will and the sea's relentless pull.
Darkness swallowed the horizon completely by the time the fifth descent ended. The sea had become a slab of black glass, streaked with white foam, the storm's full body pressing down like the hand of something ancient. The lights on the Falcon were tiny stars in that void, wavering with every roll, their glow barely touching the waves before the ocean erased it. Men moved through those circles of yellow like ghosts, slick with rain, faces hollowed by exhaustion and salt. Every movement had grown mechanical. Each command answered with a nod rather than a voice. Each step measured by the pitch of the deck. Fatigue had settled into their bones like the cold itself, but no one dared sit too long. They had hauled 21 souls out of the deep now, each one proof that courage could be more stubborn than water. Yet 14 still remained below, their air thinning, their strength fading. Between the next dive and death, there stretched only this endless night, this storm that refused to pass. Momsen leaned against the rail, coat whipping in the wind, pipe long gone cold in his pocket. His eyes were fixed on the black surface, seeing what no one else could, the shape of the Squalus beneath, the men waiting, the narrow column of water that separated them from salvation. Around him, the ship's machinery hissed and thudded, winches clinking softly as they cooled, chains groaning against their mounts. The rescue chamber rested in its cradle, scarred from use, its metal skin beaded with seawater. Crewmen swarmed it with lanterns, tightening bolts, checking gauges, wiping condensation from valves that would freeze if left alone. They spoke little. The sea spoke enough for everyone. Waves slapped against the hull in an irregular rhythm, like slow breathing. Somewhere below deck, a generator coughed, flickered, and caught again. The Falcon was tired too. The divers sat in the shadow of the chamber, their faces gray under the lantern light. Mihalowski flexed his hands, wincing at the rawness between his fingers. His partner stared out toward the horizon, eyes unfocused. They had been awake for more than 20 hours. Every descent drained them. Every ascent left their muscles trembling from pressure shifts and adrenaline. Yet, when Momsen asked, "Ready again?" both men nodded, without hesitation. There was no bravado left, just duty, worn thin but unbroken. They knew what waited below. They also knew there was no one else to go. Rain intensified, a hard, slanting torrent that blurred the line between sea and sky. It rattled across helmets, hissed on the hot lamps, filled every gap with noise. The smell of ozone and diesel hung thick in the air. Somewhere aft, a loose hatch slammed in the wind over and over until a sailor lashed it down with rope. "We'll have to wait a bit," Momsen said, voice raised over the roar. "Currents are too wild." Waiting meant more time lost, more oxygen consumed below, but to descend in this churned water would be suicide. He studied the barometer, then the surface swells. 4, maybe 5 meters, each one threatening to snap the cable like a thread. The decision cut him like a blade, but he had to make it. "Hold until the gusts ease," he ordered. The men nodded, some with visible relief, others with quiet despair. They retreated to the lee side of the deck, huddling under canvas awnings, watching the storm rage around them. Minutes turned to hours. The clock on the bridge struck midnight, the chime almost lost to thunder. The world was reduced to darkness, wind, and the small circle of light around each lamp. The crew took turns drinking scalding coffee, the only warmth left. Some leaned against bulkheads, heads drooping, sleep overtaking them in jerks and shivers. Others stood silent, eyes on the cable that disappeared into the deep, imagining the men below doing the same, waiting, watching the ceiling of their steel tomb, listening for the next scrape of salvation. In the control tent, Momsen spread out the depth charts again, tracing the contours of the seabed with one finger. He knew every rise, every hollow now. He could see the Squalus as clearly as if she sat before him. The pressure calculations danced in his tired mind like half-remembered prayers. 240 feet. Every descent took 6 minutes. Every ascent, 12. Every equalization, another 10. He whispered the numbers, hearing the tick of the chronometer sync with each one. If the weather held by dawn, they could make at least 2 more dives before daylight faded again. 2 dives to reach 14 men. It would have to be enough. He stepped outside, blinking into rain that felt like nails. The sea looked worse, not better. But then through the veil of storm, he saw a faint glow to the east, the first thin hint of morning. The clouds were still heavy, but the color had shifted from black to deep bruised blue. "We go at first light," he said to the watch officer, who only nodded, teeth chattering. Word spread along the deck. "Prepare the chamber." Men roused themselves from half-sleep, stretching stiff arms, rubbing eyes raw from salt. The divers checked their suits again, rewrapping tapes around their wrists, resealing helmets, testing air valves with the precision of habit. Each click and hiss echoed off the metal walls, a rhythm that sounded almost like hope. Below them, in the still hull of the Squalus, the survivors were losing count of time. The emergency lights had dimmed to embers, flickering on battery fumes. Condensation dripped steadily from the ceiling, forming pools that rippled with each groan of the hull. Air had turned sour, every breath thick and heavy. The men spoke little now. Some lay motionless, saving strength. Others whispered prayers or curses. It no longer mattered which. The captain sat near the forward hatch, his back against the bulkhead, head tilted as if listening. When a faint thump came through the metal, a wave striking above, he smiled weakly. "They're still there," he said. A sailor beside him nodded, too tired to answer. They drifted in and out of shallow sleep, dreams filled with light and movement that always vanished when they opened their eyes. Dawn came reluctantly. The rain softened to a mist that clung to the decks, blurring edges, turning everything a dull silver. The wind dropped just enough for the sea to catch its breath. That was all the permission Momsen needed. "We're going," he said simply. The crew moved without speech. The chamber was swung over the side again, cables greased, clamps bubble-checked. Mihalowski climbed inside first, his movements slow but sure. "Third time's the charm," he muttered. The other diver gave a tight grin. The hatch sealed, the line went taut. As the capsule slipped beneath the surface for the 6th descent, the men on deck stood silent. The usual chatter, the nervous jokes were gone. Only the rhythm of the winch remained, the deep, mechanical hum cutting through the morning haze. The sea closed over the capsule, swallowing the last glint of its lantern light. Momsen stood by the rail, coat soaked, watching until the ripples vanished. He whispered to himself, "Hold fast, boys." Around him, the ship creaked, alive with fatigue, but still moving forward, still defying the pull of the deep. The night had taken its toll, but it had not taken their resolve. Beneath the weary faces and trembling hands, there was something fiercer than restlessness, an understanding that what they were doing mattered in ways beyond orders or medals. It was the kind of work that carved itself into memory, into history, the kind that defined whether 33 men would be remembered as a tragedy or a testament. The horizon brightened slowly, pale light catching the tops of the waves. The Falcon rolled with each swell, but the men steadied themselves, eyes fixed on the water where the chamber had gone. Beneath that shifting surface, deep in the green-black cold, the small steel cylinder descended once more towards the Squalus. Between the storm above and the silence below, it carried the fragile promise that courage could outlast exhaustion, that even in the night of fatigue, the will to save could still burn brighter than fear.
Morning arrived not as light, but as a thinning of the darkness. The ocean still heaved, slow and angry, but the horizon had a rim of dull silver that promised at least the illusion of calm. Men on the Falcon rubbed at their eyes, shivering as the wind crept under collars. It was no longer night and not yet day, an in-between hour that made everything look unreal. The rescue chamber hung from its crane, dripping fog and rain, ready again. It looked smaller each time it went over the side, like a tin lamp lowered into an endless well. Yet there it swung,
tethered to human hope by a thread of steel. Orders were given softly because everyone knew them by heart. The winch groaned awake, the cable tautened, and the chamber began to sink. Momsen stood at the rail again, eyes hollow, jaw set. He didn't move, he only listened. The sea had a different sound now, a deeper note, slower, the pulse of a tired giant. He thought of the men below, 14 left, waiting in that narrow steel coffin, the air so foul it must sting their lungs. Each descent felt like rolling dice with the ocean, but he kept rolling because stopping was worse. Down in the chamber, Mihailovsky adjusted the valves with deliberate care. The pressure gauge climbed steadily, 60, 80, 120. Around them, water pressed harder, flattening every sound into a low vibration. They spoke little, every word felt like wasted oxygen. The beam from their small searchlight cut a narrow cone through drifting silt, turning the sea into a tunnel of floating dust. Their breath fogged the inside of their helmets, and they wiped it clear with gloved fingers, peering out into nothing. At 100 feet, the cable hummed as the ship above rolled. "Hold her steady," Mihailovsky murmured. The other diver nudged a control lever. The chamber steadied, its descent slow and straight. The silence down there was immense, a living thing that seemed to lean closer with every meter. When the Squalus finally appeared in the light, she looked different. Silt had settled across her hull, dulling the paint, and the sea had begun to claim her edges. The divers approached her like surgeons approaching a patient on the edge of death, knowing the next touch could heal or destroy. The chamber's skirt eased over the escape hatch, aligning by memory rather than sight. A hollow thud marked the connection. Mihailovsky exhaled. "Contact made," he said. Above, the signal echoed across the bridge. "Equalize," Momsen answered. Air hissed through pipes and the pressure difference began to close. Inside the submarine they heard it, that faint, rising whine that meant life approaching. One of them laughed, a hoarse, broken sound. "They're back," he whispered. The captain didn't answer. He was too busy counting the beats between creaks, the rhythm that told him their hull still held. The sound grew louder, then stopped. A single knock sounded on the hatch. 3 short, 1 long. The captain replied with the same code. Above him, Mihailovsky turned the wheel. The hatch opened with a cough of foul air that rolled into the chamber like smoke. He gagged, recovered, and looked down into faces that looked less human now. Eyes wide, skin gray with exhaustion, lips cracked from dryness. They reached up to him not in panic, but with quiet, deliberate movements, as if the chance might vanish if they moved too quickly. "Easy now," he said. 7 this time, same as before." They obeyed without words, climbing one by one into the chamber. Each movement was an act of will against weakness. The air inside was thick, damp, almost liquid. The divers checked straps, secured helmets, counted heads. 7 aboard, Mihailovsky said into the line. "Closing hatch." He spun the wheel until the metal screamed and sealed. The hiss of equalization reversed, and the chamber began to grow lighter. On the surface, the crew watched the line strain upward again, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the winch. The sun finally broke through the clouds, a weak white coin hanging over the gray water. It wasn't warm, but it was light, and that was enough. Steam rose from the deck where rain met metal. Every man's face was pale, lips blue, but they watched the gauges like gamblers waiting for dice to stop rolling. "Passing 150, the winch operator said. The cable sang, a long metallic hum. The drum turned and the numbers ticked upward. 100, 80, 60. Then the chamber broke the surface in a burst of spray. For a moment it spun wildly, caught by wind and wave. The crane groaned, swung, and lowered it into its cradle. The hatch opened to a cheer that broke across the deck like thunder. 7 more men emerged, each blinking against daylight as if it hurt.
Momsen moved among them, shaking hands, gripping shoulders. "You're safe now," he said again and again, though he wasn't sure he believed it until the last one stepped clear. Then he turned to the divers, who looked ready to fall where they stood. "Get food, get heat," he told them. "You've got 2 hours before we go again." They didn't argue, they only nodded, faces unreadable under the salt crust on their skin. The chamber was lifted, drained, rechecked. Wrenches clanged, hoses hissed, men shouted over the wind. The rhythm of the rescue had become the ship's heartbeat. Below, the last 7 men waited. The silence inside the Squalus was unbearable now. They had felt the pressure change, heard the hatch open and close above them, then fade again into stillness. The captain looked around the dim space. Only emergency bulbs glowed now, a sick orange that barely touched the steel walls. "They'll come," he said. One sailor laughed weakly. "They always do." The humor was thin, but it filled the space like oxygen. By midday, clouds had broken apart into long gray ribbons. The sea still rolled, but its fury had lessened. The men on the Falcon could almost taste victory, though no one dared to say the word. The deck was littered with empty coffee cups, lengths of cable, and the smell of oil. Everyone moved slower, as if afraid a sudden motion might jinx what they had achieved. Momsen looked at the horizon, where the sun pressed weakly through cloud, and thought of the years spent fighting to build the devices that now saved lives. He had been told it was impossible, impractical, dangerous. Now it was all that stood between life and memory. He leaned on the rail, eyes on the chamber as it was prepared for the next descent. Somewhere inside, he knew the steel was beginning to fatigue. Bolts stretched, seals wearing thin. The ocean took its price with every dive. But the job was almost done, and that thought held him upright. He looked once more toward the waves and whispered a single phrase meant for no one. Just one more trip. The wind caught the words and carried them away. Around him, the crew readied the line, the divers checked their suits, and the sea waited, patient and ancient. The dawn that had begun as a pale glimmer was now full day, but it brought no rest, only another descent, another test of men and metal. Yet for a moment, as the ship rolled gently under the weak sun, there was peace. The battle against the deep had not been won, but the men on the Falcon had learned how to fight it, with ropes, with lungs, with faith in things they couldn't see. And below, in the quiet hull of the Squalus, the last survivors lifted their heads toward the sound that was once again drifting down through the water, the faint, rhythmic pulse of the rescue cable, the heartbeat of hope.
By the time the next descent began, the sky had turned the color of worn metal again, light, dull, and cold, sea-flecked with white caps that moved like restless ghosts. The crew had gone too long without rest. Faces were hollow, eyes ringed with gray, movements stiff from the ache that comes when muscles forget how to relax. Yet no one stepped away from their post. The Falcon itself seemed to share their fatigue. Every roll and groan of its hull echoed the sound of overworked men. Somewhere deep inside, generators throbbed like a tired heart, keeping the pumps alive, the winch humming, the lights burning against the approaching gloom. The next descent was supposed to be the last. 7 more souls, 7 more chances to prove that persistence could outlast pressure. The chamber hung ready, its metal sides scarred, its bolts marked with chalk from the last inspection. Mahalski's hands shook slightly as he pulled on his gloves. The nerves in his fingers had grown dull from cold and immersion, and the edges of his nails were rimmed with rust stains. The other diver clamped his helmet shut and gave a brief, wordless nod. They had stopped talking before each dive. There was nothing left to say. They knew every movement by memory now. The hiss of valves, the tug of the cable, the tilt of the chamber as it surrendered to the pull of the sea. When the hatch closed above them, it was like the lid on a coffin shutting. final and necessary. The descent began with the usual jolt, the chamber sliding through the surface, water hammering against its skin, then easing as it sank into darkness. On deck, Momsen leaned against the rail, eyes fixed on the line. His lips moved silently, counting. He knew every depth mark, every second it should take to reach the bottom. The numbers steadied him. 60 feet, 90, 120. The ship rolled with each swell, making the cable groan, but the drum held steady. The air smelled of ozone and salt, and above the noise of the winch, he could hear the whistle of the wind singing through the rigging, a thin, eerie sound that seemed to echo from another world. He pulled his collar up, glanced at the barometer. Pressure was climbing again. Storm fronts circling back. There would be no calm after this. Below in the chamber, the divers felt it too. The sea pressed closer, denser, as if resentful of intrusion. The light from their lamp barely reached an arm's length. Water temperature dropped sharply. Condensation formed on the inside walls. The gauge needle quivered at 180. Michalski adjusted ballast, feeling the strain through his boots. The cable hummed louder, a low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Feels heavier today," the other diver said. Michalski nodded. "She knows we're coming back for the rest." It was half a joke, half a truth. The sea always seemed to know. At 200 feet, the chamber rocked violently. A cross-current had found them, twisting the cable, dragging them sideways. Michalski grabbed the stabilizer, muscles burning as he fought to hold position. "Surface, we're drifting," he barked into the line. Above, Momsen heard the strain in his voice and shouted to the winch operator, "Ease tension, keep her vertical." The drum turned slower, the cable straightened, and the chamber steadied after a long minute of sliding blind through the dark. Michalski's heartbeat thundered in his ears. "Still intact," he reported. "Continuing descent." The outline of the Squalus appeared again, barely visible through the gloom. Her shape was blurred by suspended silt. She looked smaller now, shrunken under the weight of the sea. The divers guided the chamber into position over the forward hatch, the motion automatic, but no less delicate for its familiarity. When metal touched metal, the sound came as a dull thud that reverberated through the steel. "Contact," Michalski said. "Equalizing pressure." Air hissed. Gauges flickered. The sea outside pressed harder as the chamber's internal pressure climbed to match the submarine's. The sound of the hull expanding under strain was like a groan from a living thing. Inside the Squalus, the men stirred weakly. The captain opened his eyes and looked toward the hatch. The air had grown so foul it stung to breathe. Condensation dripped steadily from the ceiling, pattering on faces and arms. Someone whispered, "They're back." The captain nodded. "Let's get ready." It took them minutes to stand, limbs stiff from hours of stillness. They clustered near the hatch, waiting for the faint vibration that meant the world above had returned. When it came, the first twist of the wheel, the sigh of equalization, they almost cried. The hatch opened. Michalski peered down and saw eyes staring up through the gloom, ringed with exhaustion, but alive. "7 to go," he said. One by one they climbed into the chamber, movement slow, deliberate. The last man paused, looking back into the submarine that had been both prison and shelter. "She held," he murmured, and touched the cold metal of the hatch before stepping through. Michalski sealed the wheel, checked the gauges. "All aboard," he said. "Pull us up." The winch above engaged, cable tightening, water swirling. The ascent began. At first it was smooth, the chamber rising through the heavy silence. But at 100 feet something changed. The needle on the tension gauge jerked upward.
The line vibrated violently. "She's stuck again," someone shouted on deck. Momsen's heart seized. "Hold her! Don't pull!" The operator froze. The strain meter quivered at the red line. "John, status!" Momsen called into the tube. The reply came faint, distorted. "Cables vibrating. Feels like she snagged." "Stay put. Don't touch ballast," Momsen ordered. He turned to the crew. "We'll lower 2 feet. Free her gently." The winch reversed with a groan. The tension dropped slightly, then held. The vibration ceased. "Now, steady lift," he said. The drum turned again, slow and careful. The gauge needle hovered, trembling, then crept back into safe range. Inside the chamber, the men clung to whatever they could hold, faces pale. The walls moaned as the pressure changed. Mahalski kept one eye on the gauge, one on the cable socket above. "She's holding," he muttered. The ascent resumed, every second an eternity. At last, faint light filtered through the port, a green shimmer that meant salvation. The chamber broke surface again, swaying like a pendulum. The crane caught it, swung it over the deck, lowered it onto the cradle. The hatch opened to shouts and relief that bordered on delirium. 7 more men stumbled out, blinking, coughing, gulping air as if it were a luxury. They were the last. The Squalus was empty now, her debt repaid. Momsen watched them, his face unreadable. The crew cheered around him, hats thrown in the air, voices cracking from fatigue and joy. He allowed himself one breath of satisfaction, then turned toward the sea. The pressure gauge still trembled, the cable still groaned. The battle wasn't over until the chamber was stowed, the line hauled in, the ocean left behind. "Stand by. We bring her up clean," he said quietly. The sky was clearing now, the storm finally breaking apart. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, thin but bright enough to catch the spray and scatter it into 1,000 shards of silver. The sea that had been black for days was suddenly blue again, deceptively peaceful. Men leaned on rails, eyes half closed, letting the wind wash the salt from their faces. Below them the Squalus rested in silence, her hull empty, her story complete. The pressure that had crushed, threatened, tested them all was easing at last. But in its place came another kind of weight, the knowledge of what they had done and what it had cost. For every man who stood breathing on the deck, another waited below in that dark place where rescue had arrived too late. Momsen turned away from the rail, voice hoarse but firm. "Secure the chamber," he said. "We're done here." The men moved to obey, slow but sure. The cable came in, the winch sighing as it wound the line that had connected 2 worlds. The pressure that had ruled every breath of their lives for 3 days began finally to fade. The ocean, vast and impassive, closed over the place where the Squalus lay, hiding it once more. But above, on the battered deck of a rescue ship, men had learned that even under pressure, hope could hold.
The first sunlight in 3 days came down like a trick of the eye, a hesitant wash of pale gold that spread across the Atlantic in thin strokes. The waves still carried the bruises of the storm, long rolling swells that lifted the Falcon high and set her down with a slow, weary grace. But the wind had softened, and with it the ocean's voice. It was a low rhythmic murmur now, not a roar. Around the ship the air smelled different, clean, cold, faintly metallic. The worst of the weather had passed, leaving behind a silence so sharp it rang in the ears. The men moved through it carefully, like those waking after a nightmare, unsure whether the quiet was real. They had won. That thought moved among them like a whisper no one dared to speak aloud. The chamber had made its last descent.
The final survivors stood blinking in daylight, and the Squalus lay empty below, her purpose spent. But victory in such a place was never simple. It came coated in fatigue, soaked in the knowledge that the sea had taken what it wanted first. 14 lives had been pulled from the bottom. 26 remained down there, sealed in their compartments, gone before rescue could reach them. The ocean never surrendered without a price. Momsen stood near the bow, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the horizon. He had not slept more than an hour since the first dive, but the adrenaline that had sustained him was ebbing, leaving only the ache of awareness. He could feel every vibration of the ship underfoot, every breath of wind against his face. The rescue was finished, yet his mind refused to stop calculating. Pressure ratios, oxygen flow, chamber weight, depth. Habit was hard to silence. The crew around him were cleaning up in slow motion, hoses coiled, winches oiled, tools stowed with the reverence of ritual. The rescue chamber, streaked with rust and salt, sat in its cradle, its round windows staring blindly toward the gray water as if reluctant to rest. It had done its work. It had carried men between life and death and back again. Now it was just metal once more. A gull cried somewhere above, its voice startlingly sharp in the still air. It circled the ship once, twice, then flew off toward the lighter horizon. The men watched it go, a tiny white mark against the endless blue-gray. One of the younger sailors, his face chapped raw by wind and salt, murmured, "First bird I've seen since we left port." Another nodded. "Means land's not too far." The simple conversation sounded almost holy in its ordinariness. For 3 days there had been only technical words: depth, pressure, tension, time. Now there was room again for something human. On the bridge, the radio operator leaned over his set, sending the final message back to Portsmouth. All survivors recovered, mission complete. The words ticked out across the ether, vanishing into static, carrying the story home before the men themselves could return. When the operator looked up, Momsen was there, nodding slightly. "Send our thanks to the fleet, and to the families. Tell them it's over." He turned away before the operator could answer. As the Falcon began to turn for port, the sea rolled under her hull with a long, tired sigh. The storm clouds to the west were breaking apart into towers of white that caught the sunlight and turned it gold. The men gathered along the rails, looking down at the water that had been their battlefield. They didn't speak. The view was enough. Beneath that calm surface, 240 feet down, the Squalus rested in a silence older than memory. She had become both grave and monument, a place where courage had met physics and refused to yield. Mahalowski stood near the rescue chamber, helmet tucked under an arm, skin pale and eyes bloodshot. He hadn't spoken since climbing out of the chamber after the final dive. Now he reached out and touched the side of the metal cylinder, fingertips tracing the dents and scratches. "She's earned her name," he said finally. The other diver nodded. "So have you." They laughed softly, the sound brittle but real. Momsen approached them, his coat flapping in the wind. "Good work," he said simply. Mahalowski looked at him, about to answer, then stopped. There were no words that could hold what they'd seen: the dark, the pressure, the moment when the line jammed and the world narrowed to breath and metal. They settled for a nod. That was enough. By midday the sea had changed again. Sunlight struck the waves in shards, each crest glittering like glass. The wind shifted to the south, warmer now, carrying the smell of salt and oil and something faintly sweet, perhaps land, perhaps imagination. The men began to talk again, voices low, cautious, as if afraid to break the fragile peace that had descended. Some spoke of home, others of sleep, others of nothing at all. One man asked what would happen to the Squalus. Momsen answered without turning, "We'll bring her up. Not today, but we will." It was not a boast. It was a promise, one the ocean itself seemed to hear. In the afternoon, clouds thinned enough for real sunlight to break through, spreading across the deck in long bands of gold. It caught the water dripping from the cables, turning each droplet into a tiny flame before it fell.
The light washed over the faces of the men, revealing exhaustion, yes, but also something deeper. Relief, pride, the quiet disbelief of those who have survived what should have been impossible. They stood there, motionless for a long time, until the light began to fade again into the pale blue of early evening. The storm had broken, the battle was done, and the ocean lay quiet at last. But its quiet was not forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. The sea gives nothing freely, yet on that day it had allowed 33 men to return to air and sunlight, had allowed a handful of engineers and divers to prove that human courage could reach even the places where light cannot. Momsen looked out across the fading horizon and felt the fatigue finally catch him. His hands trembled, his knees threatened to give. A sailor nearby noticed and stepped forward, but Momsen waved him off. "I'm all right," he said. "Just tired of fighting the sea." The sailor smiled. "Looks like you won, sir." Momsen shook his head. "No one wins against the ocean. We just ask her to wait." Night came softly, almost gently. The horizon burned with the last fire of sunset, red and orange bleeding into purple. The waves glowed with the reflection, each crest catching the color for a heartbeat before sinking back into shadow. The men watched until darkness returned, and for the first time since the Squalus went down, they felt the world settle into something like peace. The storm had broken, but more than that, the silence that followed was filled not with fear or sorrow, but with the sound of breathing, steady and unhurried. It was the sound of men alive, of the ocean remembering, of history being written quietly beneath their feet.
By the time the Falcon pointed her bow toward land, the sea had grown still enough that it almost seemed to pretend nothing had ever happened. The swell rolled lazy, long, each wave folding into the next with the exhausted rhythm of a creature that had spent all its fury. The sky overhead was clean for the first time in days, a hard, polished blue with streaks of white cloud curling toward the horizon. Salt had dried on every railing and face. The deck was crusted with it, the ship glittering faintly in the new light. The wind was warm now, almost soft. To the men standing along the rail, it felt like breathing again. For 3 days they had lived in the sound of steel under stress, the scream of cables, the thunder of waves. Now, the only noises were the low hum of the engines and the slap of water against the hull. It should have been peace, yet it felt strange, too quiet, too open. The crew had learned to live in that storm, in the discipline and the danger. Calm made them uneasy. They moved slower now, unsure what to do with their hands when there was no emergency to answer. Some leaned against bulkheads, faces to the wind, letting it dry their eyes. Others sat on coils of rope or crates, staring at the rescue chamber one last time as if to convince themselves it was real. The rescued sailors slept in rows under the canvas shelter near the bow. Their breathing came deep and uneven, the sound of men returning from far places. Doctors moved quietly among them, checking pulses, writing notes, whispering orders. The air around them smelled of antiseptic, coffee, and the human body, salt, oil, sweat, the faint sweetness of relief. Each man who had been pulled from the Squalus carried a different look in his eyes. Some stared at nothing, lost in the memory of pressure and darkness. Some smiled at every voice they heard. A few wept without sound. They would heal, but not all of the wounds could be seen. Momsen sat at a small table on the bridge, head bent over a notebook. His handwriting was rough, numbers running into words, but he kept writing. Coordinates, times, depths, air pressures, every detail of the rescue recorded in a hand that trembled with fatigue. He had built this system piece by piece, argued for it, fought bureaucracy, tested it in tanks and training dives. Now it had lived in the real world, under real pressure, and it had worked. That fact filled him with a quiet pride, but it did not feel like triumph.
He kept seeing the faces of the men they hadn't reached, the compartments that had sealed before rescue came. In his notes he added a line at the bottom of the page: 26 lost, 14 saved. Lessons learned at depth. He underlined the last 3 words twice. The coast appeared just after noon, a thin gray smudge that thickened as the ship moved closer. Someone shouted from the lookout, and the word rippled down the deck. Land! It spread from man to man, soft at first, then louder until laughter joined it. Land meant port, and port meant rest. The men leaned on the rails, squinting toward the faint line of shoreline that grew with each mile. Houses, trees, a lighthouse cutting a pale arc through daylight. The sight was ordinary, but after days of nothing but gray water, it looked like a miracle. For the rescued sailors, it meant the world had not forgotten them. For the crew, it meant the work was almost done. Tugs met them miles offshore, small and sturdy against the long green swells. They circled the Falcon like shepherd dogs, guiding her toward harbor. The smell of land drifted across the water, damp earth, smoke, something sweet from the fields beyond the port. Men crowded the rails to breathe it in. As the coastline sharpened, shapes began to form. Cranes, warehouses, a pier lined with waiting figures. At first, they seemed like shadows, but as the ship drew near, the figures became people. Uniforms, civilians, families. The pier was crowded to the edge, a living wall of faces. Flags fluttered, voices carried over the water. Someone began to ring a bell, slow and solemn. When the Falcon finally eased alongside, ropes were thrown, caught, tied. The gangway clanged into place. For a moment, no one moved. They only looked. Then the first of the rescued men stepped onto the gangway, supported by 2 sailors. The crowd on the pier went silent. He took one step, then another, his face pale and unreadable. When he reached the pier, the silence broke into applause, low at first, then swelling until it filled the air. The next man followed, and the next. Each one that appeared drew another wave of sound, cheers, sobs, the rumble of voices calling names. Families pushed forward, hands reaching, eyes wet. Mothers, wives, children. The kind of reunion that words could never describe. Momsen watched from the bridge, arms folded. He stayed there until the last of the survivors had gone down the gangway. Only then did he leave his post. On the dock, officials waited, reporters, admirals, politicians, all talking at once, asking for statements. Momsen shook their hands but said little. He was already thinking of the Squalus still resting below, of the divers who would one day bring her up, of the next ship that might need what they had built. The rescue was finished, but the work was not. It never would be. As the sun lowered over the harbor, the Falcon's deck emptied. The rescue chamber sat silent in its cradle, streaked with rust, its bolts still gleaming faintly where the tools had polished them clean. A few men lingered beside it, touching the metal as they passed. It looked ordinary now, stripped of its heroism by sunlight and stillness, but those who had ridden inside it knew better. They knew the sound of the sea pressing against its skin, the weight of silence broken only by breath, the vibration of the cable when the surface answered their call. They knew what it felt like to rise. Night settled over the harbor, lights flickering on along the docks. The noise faded, replaced by the creak of ropes and the distant clang of buoys. From the deck, the land looked almost too bright, too full of motion. Men who had lived for days by red emergency lamps squinted at the glare of streetlights, the warmth of windows. The Falcon floated motionless, a dark silhouette against the glow. Somewhere in the quiet, Momsen stood alone, looking down at the water. He could see his reflection trembling with each ripple.
He didn't smile, but he felt something shift inside him, a kind of peace edged with fatigue. "We brought them home," he said under his breath. The words sank into the water, carried away on the tide. And above the still surface of the Atlantic, the stars came out again, cold and sharp and endless, the same stars that had watched them fight the storm and win. The Falcon lay at rest, her crew asleep at last, her mission complete. The ocean, for now, was silent. The return to shore was not victory's trumpet. It was a quiet exhale, a single long breath after days of holding it. It was the sound of men remembering what it felt like to live.
Morning in port came slow and uncertain, sunlight filtering through a thin mist that smelled of oil and wet timber. The harbor water was calm, but streaked with the pale sheen of fuel and salt, the only trace of the storm that had followed them home. On the pier, the echo of celebration had already faded. Only the gulls remained loud. The crowd that had greeted the Falcon the night before was gone now, replaced by dockhands and officials moving with measured purpose. The ship looked smaller against the stillness, her scars visible in daylight, rusted streaks along the hull, chipped paint, cables frayed from strain. Yet she stood as proof that something impossible had been done. The rescued men were gone to hospitals and barracks, scattered to places of warmth and clean air. What remained aboard were the crew, the divers, and the quiet. The kind of quiet that sits heavy after long noise, too full of memory to be peace. Some men slept in their clothes where they'd fallen, curled under blankets on the deck, hands still stained with grease. Others walked the length of the ship as if unable to stop moving. There was no formal order given, no ceremony. They all understood that rest had to come in its own time. Momsen was awake before dawn. He moved through the ship with a slow, deliberate gait, checking each piece of equipment the way a man checks the body of a wounded friend. He paused at the rescue chamber, resting his hand on its cold side. The metal was still damp, beaded with condensation that ran in thin lines to the deck. He could see his reflection in it, warped and ghostly. "You did well," he murmured, half to himself, half to the steel. Around him, the air smelled faintly of machine oil and salt, a scent that had already become familiar. He went below to the chart room, where the records of the mission lay stacked in neat piles. Dive logs, depth calculations, atmospheric readings, times scrawled in pencil, some blurred by water stains. Each sheet was a fragment of what they had endured, a record not of victory, but of survival measured by inches and seconds. He traced a finger down one of the columns, lips moving silently as he read. Then he closed the folder and set it aside. Numbers couldn't describe what it had been like to hear the cables groan under pressure, to feel the sea pressing in like a living thing. The statistics were right, but they were empty. The truth of what had happened lived in muscle and memory, in the smell of the ocean at 200 feet, and the faces of the men they'd pulled into light. Later that morning, the Navy's officers arrived. They came in pressed uniforms, boots polished, clipboards in hand. They asked questions, technical, procedural, clinical. How long did equalization take? What was the rate of ascent per minute? How did the chamber behave under secondary current? Momsen answered each one, his voice steady but detached. These men had not heard the hull groan or felt the air turn to poison. They needed reports. He gave them facts. When they thanked him for his successful demonstration, he only nodded. Success, he thought, was a word that belonged to the living, not to the sea. Outside, reporters waited, with notebooks and flashbulbs. They wanted stories of heroism, of miracles, of triumph. The headlines would write themselves. Men saved from the bottom of the sea. Daring rescued defies the depths. Momsen stepped past them with a polite nod, answering briefly, his words precise. He gave them what they needed to fill columns, but he kept the weight of it for himself. Because the truth wasn't in the flash of cameras or the ringing of bells on the pier. It was in the silence that came when the last man had been lifted out, when the sea had gone still around them, when there was nothing left to do but breathe. By midday, the Falcon had emptied of most of her crew. The dockhands unloaded the last of the equipment, the cranes clanking as they lifted the battered rescue chamber onto a waiting truck. It swung in the air, dripping, catching sunlight on its curved sides. People on the pier stopped to watch it, the ordinary becoming extraordinary for a heartbeat. Then it was gone, carried away to a warehouse where it would be cleaned, studied, measured, improved. Tools of rescue turned back into objects again. The ship that had been alive with motion now seemed hollow, echoing with the sound of boots and distant engines. Momsen lingered on deck long after the others had left. The afternoon light was thin and sharp, cutting through the haze and glinting off the water. He leaned on the rail, watching the ripples spread outward, the reflections of cranes and masts stretching and breaking with each movement. He thought of the Squalus still lying out there in the cold dark, resting on the seabed like a question half answered. The rescue was finished, but the story wasn't. There would be another mission soon, to raise her, to bring her home in pieces or whole, to learn what the sea had done. And when that time came, they would go back. The thought brought no fear, only a quiet certainty. Evening settled early. The harbor lights came on, reflected in the smooth water, long trembling lines that reached almost to the ship. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint hum of the city beyond the docks. Somewhere a bell rang for shift change, and the sound rolled across the water like memory. Momsen straightened up, stretching his back, and let his hands fall to his sides. He felt the ache in every joint, the heaviness in his chest that came not from exhaustion, but from release. For the first time in days, there was nothing left to command, nothing to fix. The sea was calm, the men were safe, the mission done. He turned and walked slowly toward the gangway. Halfway down, he stopped and looked back. The Falcon sat quiet against the pier, her hull stained, her decks empty, but she had earned her place among ships that had done something extraordinary. Behind her, the horizon glowed faintly where the last of the sun touched the clouds. He raised his hand in a small, unconscious salute, not to the ship, not even to the men, but to the ocean itself. For all its cruelty, it had yielded to them once. That was enough. And as darkness closed over the harbor, lights flickering one by one along the shore, the air settled into stillness again. The sound of the water against the pilings was soft, almost kind. The aftermath was not silence, but a gentler rhythm, the heartbeat of the world returning to normal. Somewhere beneath that calm surface, the Squalus lay waiting, a monument of steel and memory. Above, on land, men slept, knowing they had touched the edge of death and found a way back. The sea had taken, but it had also taught, and that lesson would linger long after the noise had faded.
For a few days, the harbor remained busy, tugs and barges sliding in and out of their berths, cranes groaning, men shouting orders. On the surface, everything looked like motion, yet underneath there was a kind of hush that came after work well done. The papers called the rescue a miracle. The politicians called it proof of progress, but the men who had been there spoke little. They moved through their duties like shadows, polite to strangers, quiet among themselves. When they met each other's eyes, there was a flicker of recognition, the sort of bond that doesn't need words. The sea had marked them, and they knew it. Momsen stayed in Portsmouth longer than anyone expected. The Navy wanted briefings, reports, diagrams. He gave them what they asked for: pages of figures, sketches of valves and chambers, neat columns of data. But what he couldn't hand them was the feeling that came when the cable had gone tight, the way silence had filled the chamber between breaths,
the sound of water whispering against steel as lives hung between worlds. Those things had no place in a report. They lived instead in the spaces between numbers, in the quiet corners of his thoughts when the office emptied and the typewriter stopped. At night, he walked along the docks alone. The town lights reflected off the water in streaks of gold and green, trembling with every ripple. Somewhere out there, beyond the breakwater, lay the Squalus, a dark outline on the seabed, colder now, her compartments silent. The idea of her lingered in him like a weight he couldn't set down. He had saved the living, but the dead remained below, and in that knowledge was a kind of unfinished sentence. He told himself that raising the boat would complete it, but deep down, he knew memory was heavier than steel. Sometimes he passed the warehouses where the rescue chamber sat dismantled for inspection. Its pieces were spread across the floor, bolts, clamps, lengths of cable, the curved sections of its hull propped against wooden supports. In the bright light, it looked ordinary, small even, stripped of mystery. He ran his fingers along the edge of one panel, feeling the small dents left by tools, the scratches where gloves had slipped. The engineers talked around him, debating improvements, measuring tolerances, arguing over new alloys. Momsen nodded, offered suggestions, but his mind drifted. He could still see the faces pressed against the port, the hands reaching up through darkness. Each mark on the metal seemed to echo a breath, a heartbeat. The rescued men began to visit him. One came with a letter of thanks, another with a quiet handshake. They all said the same thing in different words. "You came for us." He smiled, accepted their gratitude, but he never quite knew what to do with it. It wasn't heroism they had shared down there. It was endurance. In the confined air of the Squalus, courage had been as simple as breathing one more time. Now that they were safe, that courage turned into something softer, more painful, a knowledge that life continued while others remained behind. Each man carried that understanding like a private shadow. As weeks passed, life in the port returned to routine. Ships came and went, cargo was loaded, fog rolled in and out. The rescue became a story told in bars and newspapers, retold until it lost its edges. But for those who had been there, memory stayed sharp. At night, in dreams, they still heard the clatter of the winch, the scream of the wind, the dull thud of contact between chamber and hull. They woke with the taste of salt in their mouths, the echo of pressure in their ears. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. For Momsen, the days blurred. He spent them in meetings, in briefings, in the small acts of bureaucracy that turned deeds into procedure. He wrote new manuals, revised safety protocols, drew plans for better chambers. But what he couldn't hand them was the feeling that came when the cable had gone tight, the way silence had filled the chamber between breaths, the sound of water whispering against steel as lives hung between worlds. Those things had no place in a report. They lived instead in the spaces between numbers, in the quiet corners of his thoughts when the office emptied and the typewriters stopped. One evening, in late autumn, he took a small launch out past the harbor mouth. The water was calm, the sky a wide band of silver cloud. He cut the engine and drifted, listening. The sound of the sea was the same as it had been that first day, steady, indifferent, infinite. He leaned over the gunwale and looked down. There was nothing to see but the reflection of his own face, rippling and breaking with each movement of the water. He whispered, "We did what we could," not as an excuse, but as a benediction. The words vanished into the air, carried away by the wind. When he returned to shore, the docks were empty. The lights of the town shimmered in the distance, warm against the gray. He realized then that the weight he carried wasn't guilt or grief. It was memory itself, the sheer gravity of having seen what most never would, of having touched the edge of death and come back. It was the understanding that courage didn't erase fear, it existed beside it. The men of the Falcon had learned that lesson at 240 feet, and it would travel with them for the rest of their lives. In the months to come,
The Squalus would be raised, refitted, and renamed. The newspapers would call it a triumph of engineering, proof that no loss was permanent. But for Momsen and the others, the victory had already been written in those long hours of waiting, in the hiss of valves, in the slow lift through black water. The sea had offered them a glimpse of its mercy and then closed again, holding its secrets tight. And as the seasons changed and the world moved on, the weight of memory settled into something quieter, not a burden, but a reminder that even in the deepest places, a spark of will can outlast the dark.
The spring that followed was a different kind of season. The gales had moved north, the Atlantic turned glassy, deceptively gentle, and the coastline began to smell of thawed earth and wet rope. Yet, out past the harbor buoys, in that quiet stretch of water where sunlight barely pierced the surface, the Squalus still lay waiting. Her shape had not shifted much through the winter, a long, dark wound on the seabed, silt gathered around her hull like a shroud. Fish moved through her open hatches, weeds had begun to trail from her fins. From above, she looked like nothing at all, just another shadow on the bottom, but the men who had been there the year before knew what she was. The Navy's order to raise her came in March. It was written in the flat language of directives. Proceed with salvage of submarine Squalus, to be raised for refit and study. It was a line of text, impersonal, but behind it was a simple truth: they couldn't leave her down there. She was both a lesson and a promise. The same men who had rescued her crew now gathered again, some from other assignments, others drawn back by a pull they didn't try to name. Momsen was among them, older by months that felt like years, his uniform more worn, his eyes clearer. He didn't have to lead this mission, but he came anyway. The sea had a way of calling people back. When the salvage ships steamed out of port that May, the sky was clear and the water flat enough to mirror it. The deck crews worked in silence at first, laying out cables as thick as a man's arm, checking the air pumps, fitting the pontoons that would one day lift the submarine from the mud. It was work that had nothing of drama about it, only patience and weight. Men moved slowly, measuring, marking, lowering lines that disappeared into the green void below. They knew the shape of the ground now, every rise and hollow mapped during the rescue. They knew how cold the water was, how quickly pressure could turn a mistake into a tragedy. There was no fear this time, only respect. Momsen spent hours at the rail, watching the pattern of bubbles where divers worked far beneath. The water broke occasionally with their exhalations, silver bursts that vanished instantly. Through the radio he heard their clipped voices. Pontoons secure on bow section, moving aft, visibility fair. Each word carried through static like a heartbeat. He thought of those same depths months ago, of men trapped in silence where now there was motion and speech. The sea, once a cage, was now a workplace. It was a strange inversion that made him uneasy, but he trusted the divers. They were different now, men who had faced that darkness once and returned knowing its shape. Day by day they threaded cables under the Squalus, sliding steel through mud and debris, connecting sections that hadn't been touched since she sank. When the first cable tightened, there was a groan that everyone on deck could feel through their boots, a low, living sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was as if the sea protested the disturbance of its claim. The winches held steady, the strain meters climbed, and slowly the submarine shifted. Silt boiled up in clouds, darkening the water. Divers surfaced, coughing through their mouthpieces, faces gray from the cold. "She moved," one of them said simply.
and the men on deck nodded. A small motion, a start. Lifting the dead was never quick work. Over the next weeks they raised her in stages, section by section, using pontoons filled with compressed air. The process was methodical, exhausting. Each morning began with the same ritual, testing lines, checking weather, reviewing charts. Each evening ended with the same sight, men leaning on rails, watching the sea reclaim its stillness after a day of intrusion. When the bow finally broke the surface in June, streaked with rust and seaweed, a hush fell over the ships. No one cheered, they only watched as water poured from the open hatches, cascading back into the sea. The submarine rose slowly, groaning, her black hull glistening like white stone. Sunlight struck her for the first time in a year, and for a moment she seemed alive again, a creature dragged unwillingly from the deep. Momsen stood apart, hands clasped behind him, the salt wind tugging at his coat. He felt no triumph, only a quiet gravity. They had taken her name, her crew, her purpose, and brought her back into a world that had already moved on. She would be refitted, renamed Sailfish, sent again into service, but the Squalus would always be what she had been that day she went down. A reminder of the thin line between control and surrender, between air and water. He watched the cranes swing over her, cables glinting in the sun, and thought of the men who had died within those walls. Now they would be honored, but honor was a poor trade for breath. When she was finally secured to the salvage ship, the water around her turned calm again. The crew gathered on deck, silent as a congregation. Some removed their caps, others simply stood with heads bowed. There were no speeches, no ceremony. The moment itself was enough. They had brought her home. The harbor would see her again, her hull cleaned and painted, her nameplate changed, but the men who had lifted her knew the truth. No new coat of paint could hide where she had been. That night, long after the work lights dimmed, Momsen walked the length of the deck alone. The air was cool, the stars bright above the still sea. The Squalus lay beside them, her bulk looming in the shadows, dripping quietly. He stopped near her bow and rested a hand on the cold steel. "You came up after all," he said softly. It wasn't triumph in his voice, but something gentler, a kind of respect. The ocean had released her, grudgingly, and he understood what that meant. Some things could be recovered, but never unchanged. The men who had been saved, the divers who had risked their lives, the engineers who had built the impossible, they all carried a piece of that depth with them. And now, in the dark stillness of the Atlantic night, the Squalus did too. When dawn came, the sea was calm again, the sky pale and empty. The salvage fleet turned for home, their engines leaving long wakes that spread like scars across the surface. Behind them, the water closed, smooth and indifferent. The ocean had given back what it had taken, but only because men had asked with courage and patience instead of arrogance. That was its price. Momsen watched the horizon fade, the smell of salt and oil in his lungs, and felt the weight inside him shift. It was still there, that heavy memory of pressure and darkness, but it had changed shape. It was no longer something to carry, it was something to remember. A part of him now, like the sea itself, endless, merciless, and in its own way, forgiving.
The day they painted the new name on her hull was bright and still, one of those rare mornings when the harbor looked like glass and the smell of salt hung soft instead of sharp. The cranes had gone, the salvage barges moored elsewhere.
What remained in the dock was a shape both familiar and strange, a submarine reborn from her own shadow. The welders had patched her seams, the painters had smoothed the scars, the engineers had rebuilt her systems piece by piece. And yet, beneath the layers of gray primer and black hull paint, the steel still remembered pressure and darkness. The men who had been there could feel it like a pulse. The dockyard workers moved with quiet precision. A stenciled outline on the bow, a few steady strokes of white paint, and the letters began to take form. SAILFISH. The new name gleamed against the black surface, sharp and clean. To the officials gathered along the pier, it was a symbol of recovery, of progress, of a navy that refused to bow to failure. To the few who had seen her before, it was something else. They watched the transformation without applause, knowing that names could be changed, but history could not. The sound of the brushes was the same rhythm that had once echoed in the deep, the soft scrape of human hands working against the silence of the sea. Momsen stood apart, his cap tucked under his arm, eyes narrowed against the morning light. He had been asked to attend the renaming ceremony, to say a few words about innovation and perseverance. He would speak, but what he would say was still uncertain. Around him, officers chatted, photographers adjusted lenses, reporters scribbled headlines before the speeches even began. He heard phrases, rebirth, testament to engineering, naval triumph, but none of them felt right. To him, this wasn't rebirth, it was continuation. The Squalus hadn't died, and she hadn't been resurrected. She had simply changed shape like the sea she came from. When the ceremony began, the band played softly, brass and drum echoing off the water. The commanding officer of the yard stepped forward, his voice carrying over the dock. Today we honor not only a vessel, but the men who refuse to let the ocean have the final word. This ship stands as proof that courage, discipline, and ingenuity can bring life from loss. From this day forward, the Squalus will sail under a new name, USS Sailfish. The applause that followed rolled across the dock like a wave. Polite but genuine, Momsen stood when his name was called. He walked to the podium slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. The wooden boards under his boots creaked, and for a heartbeat he was back on the deck of the Falcon, listening to the storm breathe. He looked out at the crowd, faces expectant, sunlight flashing on brass buttons, and then at the submarine behind them. Her bow gleamed, her new name bright and almost too white. He took a breath and began to speak. There are moments when the ocean reminds us what it is. It is not an enemy, and it is not a friend. It is a force. It takes what it wants, and sometimes, if we are careful and lucky, it lets us take something back. Last year, 33 men saw its darkness and came home again. 26 others stayed behind, and in their memory we built something that works, that saves lives. This ship bears a new name, but her story will always begin with them. He paused. The air was still. The only sound was the soft lap of water against the dock. I have been asked many times how it felt to pull men out of the sea, to bring a boat back from the bottom. The truth is simple. It felt like listening to the heart of the world and hearing it beat again. The Sailfish isn't just a ship. She's proof that knowledge can grow from sorrow, that courage can leave something behind other than loss. That's all we ever hope for. He nodded once, stepped back from the podium, and saluted the submarine. The band began to play again, and the crowd clapped, but the applause sounded far away, muffled by the weight of what hung unspoken in the air. Afterwards, as the officials dispersed and the photographers packed their equipment, Momsen stayed behind. The dock was quiet again, sunlight glancing off the ripples. He walked slowly along the pier until he reached her hull, close enough to see his reflection warped in the curve of the metal. The new paint still smelled fresh,
He ran a hand over the letters, feeling the faint ridge of each one. Sailfish. A name meant to look forward, to erase the shadow of the past. But as he stood there, he felt both names at once, the old and the new, like two layers of sound that could never quite separate. Beneath the brightness of the paint was the same steel that had once held men in darkness, waiting for the knock that meant salvation. He closed his eyes and remembered that sound. The tap on the hatch, the hiss of air equalizing, the gasp of a man taking his first breath of safe air. The memory rose and fell with the tide. He wondered if the sea remembered too. It was strange to think that somewhere, far below, the currents that had carried fear and courage alike were still moving, indifferent, eternal. When he opened his eyes, the harbor was beginning to shift into afternoon. Workers moved aboard the sailfish, checking lines, running cables, preparing her for the tests that would prove her seaworthy again. Life went on. The ship would dive again, soon, not into disaster this time, but into training, into readiness, into the rhythm of a fleet always preparing for the next unknown. The world beyond the dock was changing too. News of war in Europe drifted across the Atlantic like a slow-coming storm. Momsen watched the horizon for a long time, as if he could already see the shadows gathering there. The sailfish would have work to do again, and so would he. He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing along the pier. Behind him, the ship lay quiet, her new name bright against the dark hull, her reflection wavering on the surface of the water. For a moment the wind shifted, rippling the reflection so that the letters blurred, white turning into gray, sailfish dissolving back into Squalus. The sea remembered. It always did. And in that merging of names, one buried, one reborn, was the true story of the ocean and the men who served it, that nothing is ever truly lost, only changed, that the depths give back what they take, but never in the same form, that memory, like the tide, always returns.
Months slipped into years, and the sea forgot the names men gave to it. Ships came and went across its skin, leaving only brief scars that the tide healed each night. The sailfish sailed again, her hull sleek, her engines tuned to a lower, steadier hum. From the outside, she looked nothing like the wreck that had once rested on the bottom. Inside, she still carried ghosts. The new crew moved through her narrow passages with the same mixture of pride and superstition that sailors have always carried. They touched the hatch before dives. They spoke softly when the depth gauge passed 200 feet. They knew her history, though none of them had been there to live it. The story had become legend, a whisper of steel and breath, and the knock that meant rescue. Out at sea, the sailfish performed as if eager to prove herself. She dove clean, surfaced strong, her machinery running smoother than even her designers expected. She was no longer a grave, but she was never quite a normal ship either. When she submerged, the air changed. The veterans said they could feel it, the pressure rising, the hum deepening, a shift in the tone of the metal that seemed almost like memory. Sometimes in the long hours beneath the surface, a man would think he heard something through the hull, a slow, distant tap, the echo of that first rescue. No one said it aloud, but everyone listened for it. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. Momsen watched her trials from the deck of an escort vessel, binoculars steady against the wind. When the sailfish broke the surface, water pouring off her conning tower and bright arcs, he felt a quiet satisfaction. She had survived the impossible and returned not as a symbol of loss, but as proof of persistence. Around him, younger officers took notes, spoke of engineering refinements, new safety valves, stronger alloys. He let them talk. Their excitement belonged to the future. His thoughts drifted backward, to the faces of men illuminated by red lights, to the hiss of air equalizing in the rescue chamber. He didn't need progress reports to measure what this meant. The fact that she could dive again at all was enough. The Navy used her as a training boat now, teaching younger crews the same lessons bought with fear and pressure. They learned how to listen to the hull, how to trust gauges more than instinct, how to measure courage and breaths per minute. On her first deep dive after refit, the captain, a man too young to have known the Squalus, invited Momsen aboard as an observer.
"I thought you'd want to see her below again," he said, with a grin that was equal parts respect and challenge. Momsen hesitated, then nodded. Part of him wanted to decline, to leave the past sealed where it belonged, but another part, the one that had built the chamber and tested the valves, still wanted to hear the deep with his own ears. The dive was scheduled at dawn. The harbor was still half asleep, the water smooth as slate. As the sailfish slipped free from the dock, her engines throbbed low and even. Momsen stood on the bridge, coat buttoned to his throat, watching the coastline fade. The air smelled clean, with that faint tang of metal and oil that belonged only to submarines. When the order came to dive, the deck crew sealed the hatches with practiced precision. Valves opened, ballast tanks filled with the soft rush of water. The horizon tilted upward, and daylight narrowed to a circle that shimmered and vanished. Below, the world turned green, then gray, then black. The pressure gauge climbed, the metal around them tightened. It was the same sound he remembered, but gentler now, a steady breath instead of a groan. He moved through the control room, noting how calm the crew looked, focused, methodical. The air tasted dry, not heavy with fear. The captain nodded toward the depth meter. 200, he said. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Momsen smiled faintly. "She's steadier than I remember." The younger man laughed. "We built her right this time." They leveled out at 300 feet. The lights dimmed to red. The only sounds were the hum of motors and the faint creak of the hull adjusting to the water's weight. Momsen leaned against a bulkhead and closed his eyes. He could almost feel the echoes moving through the steel, the vibrations of all those earlier hours, the weight of every man who had waited in silence for help that might never come. He whispered to himself, "It's all still here." The officer beside him glanced over. "Sir?" "Nothing," Momsen said. "Just listening." After an hour they began the ascent. The pitch of the engines changed, and the pressure eased. When the hatch opened to sunlight again, Momsen stepped onto the bridge and filled his lungs with air that smelled of salt and sky. The sea was calm, the horizon bright. Behind him, the sailfish rose fully from the water, gleaming and alive. For the first time since the rescue, he felt something close to release. The circle had closed. The ship that had sunk, the men who had been lost, the machine that had saved them, it had all come back to the surface in one form or another. That evening back on shore, he wrote in his logbook, "Sailfish dive successful, crew steady, hull sound, sea quiet." Then, after a long pause, he added one more line, "Echoes remain." He didn't mean ghosts or memories. He meant the lingering pulse of what courage feels like when pressed to its limits. It was in the steel, in the men, in the silence between heartbeats when the ocean waited. Those echoes were not haunting, they were reminders. The sea remembers, but so do those who dare to enter it. When night fell, the harbor lights reflected off the calm water, each one trembling with the tide. From the dock, the sailfish looked almost serene, her shadow long and dark beneath the surface. Momsen stood there for a while, coat collar turned up against the wind. Somewhere out beyond the buoys, the deep called with its usual voice, steady, endless, indifferent. He listened until the sound became familiar again, until it no longer spoke of fear, but of continuity. The echoes beneath the waves would never stop, and neither would the work of those who listened to them.
By the time autumn rolled over the coast, the sailfish had become more than a vessel. She was a classroom, a symbol, a breathing memory of what men could endure and what they could learn. Her logbooks filled with quiet records, training dives, sonar drills, rescue simulations. Each line of ink was part of a story that had begun in darkness and pressure, a story that refused to fade. In shipyards across the country, engineers copied her blueprints, improving the valves and clamps that had once been invented in desperation. The Momsen lung, his portable rebreather, was now standard issue. Every sailor carried a small piece of that first rescue against his chest, a promise written in rubber and metal. When Momsen visited the training school, he walked through rooms filled with young faces who had never seen the bottom of the Atlantic. They listened politely when he spoke, some out of respect, others because they had been told to. To them, the sea was a theory, a line in a textbook, a number on a gauge. They would learn soon enough that it was more than that.
He told them what mattered most. The ocean is not cruel, it is honest. It gives back exactly what you bring to it: discipline or carelessness, courage or fear. The room went quiet at that, the kind of silence that marks understanding before words catch up. Later, when the class dismissed, one young man stopped him at the door. "Sir," he asked, "did you ever stop being afraid down there?" Momsen smiled slightly. "No," he said, "you just learned to breathe through it." At the docks, the sailfish rested between drills. Her paint was duller now, her hull stained with salt, but she was still graceful. The sea's tension balanced perfectly along her spine. Watching her rise and dive had become routine to the men of the base, but not to Momsen. Each time she disappeared beneath the surface, he felt the same old pressure in his chest, not fear anymore, but respect. The deep had its own memory. It didn't care for medals or ceremonies, only for endurance. It remembered those who had gone down, those who had come back, and those who had dared to try. Letters arrived from across the Navy, reports of submariners saved by new gear, rescues that ended in success instead of silence. Each one was a small echo of that first time, proof that what had been born out of failure was now saving lives quietly all over the world. He read them alone in his office, sometimes smiling, sometimes simply sitting in the stillness afterward. He never wrote back with congratulations, he only wrote one word: continue. But the legacy of the deep wasn't only in machines or manuals. It lived in the way sailors spoke about the sea now, with a little less arrogance, a little more awe. The old superstition that a sunken boat should be left in peace had given way to a new kind of faith, that knowledge could honor the dead better than silence could. Salvage ships were built stronger, rescue chambers more reliable. The Navy's divers trained longer, learned patience from the men who had once waited at the bottom. Out of one disaster had grown an entire discipline, a way of turning fear into foresight. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Momsen would walk the piers. The water there was black and smooth, the sky above wide and empty. He liked those hours best, when the world felt balanced between motion and rest. He would stop and look down at the reflections of the harbor lights, trembling in the tide. Each one seemed to reach downward, stretching into the darkness where the Squalus had once slept. The sea was calm, but beneath it he could almost hear that old, low heartbeat, the pulse of the deep reminding him that everything eventually returns to silence. He didn't fear it anymore. He understood it. The ocean silence wasn't erasure, it was memory held still. There were nights when he dreamed of that first storm, the rolling deck of the Falcon, the hiss of rain, the metallic groan of the rescue line. In his dreams, the chamber still hung between surface and seabed, caught in that terrible, beautiful tension between worlds. And when he woke, he always lay still for a long moment, listening to the quiet of his room, the distant murmur of the sea through the window. The dream wasn't haunting, it was a reminder of what it meant to be alive. He had spent years fighting the deep, but in truth he had learned to live by its rhythm. As the years went on, younger officers took command of the sailfish, her missions growing longer, her dives deeper. Wars would come, and she would serve again, silent and unseen, a ghost-turned weapon. But through all of it, her name carried a weight that no refit or repainting could erase. Every time she slipped beneath the surface, she carried with her the memory of men who had waited in darkness and believed that someone would come. That belief, more than any machine, was Momsen's legacy. The certainty that even in the deepest night there would always be a knock on the hatch, a sound that meant someone was still trying. On his last day at the base, he stood on the pier and watched the sailfish leave for sea again. The morning light was bright, the water still. She moved without fuss, a line of black against the horizon, until she was only a shadow and then nothing at all. The ocean accepted her easily, as if recognizing an old friend. Momsen stayed until the ripples faded. Then he turned away, the sound of the tide in his ears. The deep would keep its secrets, but not its lessons. Those were already in the hands of the next generation. The legacy of the deep was not carved in stone or written in reports. It was carved in breath, in patience, in the steady hands that refused to let go of a cable, no matter how it sang with strain. It lived wherever men faced the vastness and chose to descend anyway. It lived in the understanding that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act while afraid. It lived quietly and endlessly in the rhythm of the sea itself. And as he walked away from the docks for the last time, the wind came up from the east, bringing with it the faint salt smell of the open ocean. He stopped, closed his eyes, and breathed it in. For a moment he could almost hear it again, the knock, the hiss of air, the heartbeat of steel under pressure. Then it was gone, leaving only the sound of waves against the pier and the whisper of history settling into memory. The deep had given its lesson. The rest belonged to those who would follow.
The decade turned, and the quiet that had filled the harbors of peacetime dissolved into the low, constant hum of mobilization. The world that had once been content to measure its strength in machines and industry now measured it in the echo of distant guns. Across the Atlantic, ships gathered like flocks of iron birds, their gray silhouettes merging with the horizon. The sailfish, once a symbol of recovery, found herself drawn into a new kind of struggle, one that was silent, unseen, and waged in the dark water where light could not reach. She was no longer a story of survival alone. She was a weapon now, carrying men who trusted her the way others trusted faith. When the orders came, they were simple: patrol, observe, report. But beneath those words was an understanding that every dive carried the same old risk. The ocean hadn't changed, only the reasons men went down into it. The sailfish's hull was stronger now, her systems more refined, but the air still grew heavy the deeper she sank, and the silence still pressed like a living weight. The young men aboard spoke of war in the language of strategy and duty. The older ones spoke less. They had seen what water could do. From the coast of New England, she slipped out on her first wartime patrol under a moon so bright it turned the waves to silver. The crew stood topside until the shoreline vanished, then sealed the hatches and dove. The ocean accepted them easily, folding over their wake without a trace. Within minutes, the world narrowed to instruments, whispers, and the rhythmic thrum of the engines. To those who had never been below, war meant noise, shells, bombs, the crack of gunfire. To submariners, war meant silence. The enemy could be a shadow on sonar, a vibration in the hull, a change in water pressure that made every muscle tighten. Momsen was no longer at sea then, but he followed every patrol through the reports that crossed his desk in Washington. Each one was a heartbeat in ink, brief and factual. Sailfish departed Portsmouth 1800 hours, sighted convoy, evaded detection, depth 250, all systems stable. They were the same sentences he had once written about survival, now turned to the business of warfare. He read them slowly, hearing the sea in every word. He knew what it felt like to live at that depth, to breathe recycled air, to listen for sounds that might mean life or death. The reports were sterile, but the silence between the lines was full of ghosts. In December of 1941, the Pacific caught fire. Pearl Harbor changed everything, and the ocean that had once been a place of rescue became a battlefield stretching from the Aleutians to the Philippines. Submarines, quiet and unseen, became hunters. The sailfish, older now but still swift, transferred to the Pacific Fleet. Her crew was younger than the ship, men who had grown up hearing the story of the Squalus, who called their boat Lucky. They painted her name proudly on the conning tower, believing it carried protection, not memory. Momsen, now overseeing submarine operations, watched her departure from a dock in Pearl Harbor. He didn't wave, he only saluted. War beneath the waves was not like war on land. There were no front lines, no trenches, only the constant negotiation between stealth and survival.
The sailfish prowled along enemy shipping routes, her periscope slicing the surface like thin needles. She listened more than she spoke, hydrophones catching the distant churn of propellers, the faint rhythm of convoys moving through fog. When she struck, it was sudden, torpedoes streaking through green-black water, explosions muffled to dull thunder, then the long wait for counterattack. Depth charges followed, rolling patterns of sound and shock that turned the sea into chaos. The hull flexed, lights flickered, and every man aboard held his breath, listening for the note that meant they had been found. After each patrol, when she limped back to port scarred but intact, her crew carried a silence that others mistook for pride. They had lived through hours where noise meant death and quiet meant safety. It took time to relearn speech. Momsen met them sometimes, walking the docks, listening to their clipped stories. "We hit 2 transports, came back on fumes," they would say. He would nod, but what he saw in their eyes wasn't victory, it was understanding. The sea was still the same, impartial and infinite. It didn't care whether the hands inside the hull were rescuing or destroying. It only asked that they respect it. By 1943, the sailfish had earned her place among the fleet's veterans. She carried scars from shrapnel, a dented hull plate near the bow, a faint whine in her motors at certain depths. She was no longer the ship of her youth, but she was steady, and in war, steadiness was everything. Her logbooks filled with strange poetry. Contact faint, bearing 270. Enemy destroyer passed overhead, depth 280, holding trim. Each entry written in the same dry tone, each one describing a day where men's lives hung on the tension of a steel shell against the weight of a world. The crew joked that their ship had already been to hell once and come back, so nothing the ocean did now could surprise her. The joke carried a truth they all half believed. Momsen's innovations, his chambers, his rebreathers, his rescue systems, followed them into war. Ironically, he hoped they would never need to be used again. Every new submarine carried the tools to survive the deep, but the best rescue was always the one that never had to be attempted. Still, he knew that the sea had a long memory. He knew it waited. Each time he saw a submarine's name marked as lost, Thresher, Grunion, Wahoo, he felt the weight of that silence all over again. It was the same silence that had filled the Squalus, the same darkness he had looked into and spoken to. The quiet war was relentless, and its only witness was the ocean itself. When the war finally turned and the Pacific began to empty of its wrecks, the sailfish returned to port for the last time. Her paint was scorched, her deck scarred, but she was alive. Men lined the rails and cheered as she eased into harbor. The same ship that had once drowned had now survived 2 wars, the first against the ocean, the second against men. Momsen, standing among the crowd, felt something inside him settle. The circle that had begun in darkness ended here, in sunlight and noise. He tipped his cap to her as she passed. Around him, the sea lapped gently at the pier, its rhythm unchanged. The quiet war had ended, but its echoes would not fade. They would live in the metal of the ships, in the lungs of the divers, in the stories sailors told in the low light of bars long after midnight. And somewhere far below, where the water was still and cold, the Squalus was still lying, her empty hull listening to the same eternal song. The ocean kept its history. The men who had learned to move through it quietly had simply added another verse.
The war ended the way storms do, slowly, unevenly, with a kind of dazed calm that no one trusted at first. Ships that had moved for years with purpose now drifted in harbors without orders. The flags were still, the guns covered, the air heavy with that strange mix of relief and disorientation that follows survival. The sailfish was among the last to return. Her conning tower rose out of the dawn haze like a memory surfacing. Her paint was scoured, her numbers faded by salt and time, but she came home under her own power. Men who had been boys when she left stood on her deck now with faces lined by fatigue. The sea had carved its initials into them, quiet and permanent. At the pier in Pearl Harbor, crowds waited,
dockworkers, officers, wives, children who had never seen their fathers in daylight. They had imagined this moment 100 different ways, and now that it was here, it felt unreal. The air shimmered with heat, gulls wheeling overhead, the smell of oil and salt rising from the water. When the mooring lines hit the dock, a cheer went up, not the loud, exuberant shout of victory, but something steadier, deeper, threaded with exhaustion. The men stepped ashore one by one, blinking against the brightness, each carrying a duffel that seemed lighter than the weight they left behind. There were handshakes, embraces, long silences that said more than words could. Momsen was there, standing a little apart from the crowd. He looked older now, the sun glinting off the lines at his temples. The officers saluted him as they passed, but he didn't return the gesture. He only nodded, his gaze fixed on the ship. The sailfish had been through so many transformations, wreck, survivor, warrior, and yet seeing her tied again to a peaceful pier felt strange, almost fragile. The world around her had changed. The men she had carried into danger were walking on land again. The ocean, for the first time in years, was quiet. He stepped aboard in the late afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the heat had softened. The deck creaked under his boots, and the smell of diesel and rust rose like incense. He walked slowly, touching the handrails, the hatches, the metal that had once held both fear and salvation. In the control room, the gauges were still, the lights dim. The silence there was different now. Not the silence of depth or danger, but the kind that comes after a long song ends. He stood where the captain would have stood, one hand resting on the periscope, and listened to the faint hum of the ship settling against the pier. It felt like standing inside a heartbeat that had finally slowed to rest. Outside, the sun slid toward the horizon, turning the harbor gold. The water caught the light, rippling it against the hull in small, fleeting patterns. Momsen stepped back onto the pier and watched the sailfish from a distance. Her shadow stretched long across the surface, merging with the reflections of cranes and ropes and sky. For a moment, the distinction between ship and sea blurred, and she looked almost as she had that first day she was raised, half in the world, half out of it. The homecoming wasn't loud or ceremonial. It was quiet, like everything the deep had taught them. He thought about the men who hadn't come back, the 26 who still rested in the Squalus, the dozens lost in other boats since. The sea had given up many of its dead, but not all. It never would. He had long stopped thinking of it as cruel. It was simply exact. It kept what it must, returned what it could. The balance was never emotional, only elemental. As he stood there, the air thick with the scent of salt and fuel, he realized that this too was a kind of mercy. The ocean didn't forget. It remembered differently. Its homecomings were not parades but stillness, not noise but recognition. Later that evening, as dusk deepened and the lights along the pier flickered to life, the crew gathered one last time on the deck. They didn't speak much. Someone passed around a bottle and they drank quietly, looking out at the dark water. The youngest sailor asked, "Do you think she'll go down again?" No one answered for a while. Finally, the captain said, "She's earned her rest." They all nodded. It wasn't just the ship. It was themselves they were talking about. They had gone deep enough for several lifetimes. Now it was time to breathe air without waiting for gauges to tell them it was safe. Momsen walked away from the pier after sunset. Behind him, the sailfish lay still, her hull a darker shadow against the night. He could hear the faint slap of waves against her sides, steady and unchanging. The sound followed him down the road, past the warehouses and the fuel tanks, past the smell of oil and the distant laughter of sailors finally free. It was the same sound that had followed him all his life, the ocean's quiet voice speaking without words, asking nothing but presence. He realized then that he would never escape it, nor did he want to. The sea was not an enemy or a teacher anymore. It was simply home.
When he reached the end of the dock, he turned once more to look back. The harbor lights shone like stars caught in the water, and for a moment he imagined the reflection moving, the faint shimmer of the Squalus still down there, her outline sleeping in the silt. 2 ships, 2 names, 2 lives bound by one sea. One resting, one returned. He took off his cap, held it against his chest, and bowed his head. The gesture was small, almost invisible in the dark, but it carried everything. The years, the storms, the weight of memory that had brought him here. "Rest well," he whispered. "We all came home in our own way." Then he walked on, the sound of the tide following him like footsteps fading into distance. The deep was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. It held echoes, promises, and the unbroken rhythm of those who had dared to descend and return. The sailfish slept, the Squalus dreamed, and the ocean, vast and eternal, turned over gently in its sleep.
The harbor slept beneath a thin veil of morning mist, that fragile hour before dawn when the world seemed to hold its breath. The sea was glass again, deceptively calm, the kind of stillness that only comes after years of motion. The sailfish sat moored in her berth, her deck slick with dew, her hull dark and quiet. She was a relic now, a survivor twice over, and there was a certain weight to her silence. To the men who passed her each day, she was no longer a warship or a miracle. She was a reminder. Steel didn't age the way men did. It didn't wrinkle or gray, but it remembered every pressure, every depth, every sound. Momsen stood by the pier's end again, coat buttoned against the chill. The years had carved him leaner, the wind roughened his face, but his posture remained unbent. He came here often now, not as a commander or inventor, but as something simpler, a man measuring what he'd given to the sea and what it had given back. The sailfish had become a museum piece in all but name, her decks rarely stirred by crew. Tourists sometimes visited, students with notebooks, officers in training. They came for facts, the first rescue, the refit, the war record. None of them stayed long enough to hear the silence that came after the stories. That silence was the price. Every man who'd gone below the surface carried it home, tucked behind the noise of ordinary life. It showed up in small ways, the pause before answering a question, the stillness at the sound of rain, the way they watched the horizon as if waiting for something to rise from it. The sea did not take everyone who entered it, but it never returned anyone unchanged. Momsen understood that better than most. His inventions had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands by then. The Navy had given him medals, speeches, photographs. He kept them in a drawer, unopened. The honors were gestures from a world that could never truly understand what lay 200 feet beneath it. The real reward, the real cost, was in the nights when he woke to the sound of water in his dreams. Not violent, but rhythmic, patient. Sometimes he heard the tap on the hatch again, the first sound of life coming back through steel. Other times he heard nothing at all. Both were equally heavy. He'd once told a class of young divers that courage wasn't a noise, it was the absence of one. It was what filled the seconds between panic and command, the moments when your heartbeat was the only sound left in the world. Now, standing by the rail, with dawn breaking slow and red over the water, he realized that silence had followed him his whole life. It had shaped him, like the pressure that shapes steel. The Navy still called sometimes, a new sub lost off Greenland, another rescue planned in the Pacific. Each time they wanted his expertise, his name on a report, his steadying presence in the room. He gave them what he could. He offered advice, diagrams, warnings, but he knew that every generation had to earn its own understanding. You couldn't teach respect for the deep. You could only remind men
what it cost to forget it. One afternoon, years after the war, he visited a new submarine under construction. The shipyard was noisy with welding sparks and shouted orders, the smell of hot steel and paint thick in the air. The hull towered above him, smooth and seamless, its design decades ahead of the sailfish. A young engineer, proud and eager, pointed out the new systems: escape hatches, buoyant chambers, emergency lines, all descendants of his old work. "We can reach twice the depth now," the young man said. "The ocean's finally ours." Momsen smiled faintly. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It never will be. It just lets us borrow it for a while." The engineer didn't understand at first, but he nodded politely. The older man reached out and laid a hand on the hull, feeling the vibration of hammers and the slow, steady rhythm of the work. He could feel the same heartbeat in it that he'd felt in the Squalus, the sailfish, in every ship that ever touched the deep, the same pulse that said, "Remember." Later that evening, back at the pier, the sun sank low and turned the water the color of copper. The waves moved lazily against the pilings, each one breaking with the sound of breath. Momsen sat on a bench overlooking the harbor, hat resting beside him, and thought of all the men whose names were written in logs and memorials, the ones who'd gone down and the ones who hadn't come back. He didn't picture their deaths anymore. He pictured them at work, tightening valves, checking gauges, sharing cigarettes under red lights, alive in the small, disciplined motions that made courage visible. The sea had taken many of them, yes, but it had also taught them something profound, that silence wasn't emptiness, but balance, that pressure could be a teacher if you survived it. He smiled slightly at the thought. "Everything worth doing," he murmured, "asks for silence first." When darkness fell, he rose and walked to the edge of the dock. The sailfish was a darker shape against the dim horizon, her reflection trembling in the black water. He stood there for a long time, listening. The harbor around him hummed with the faint noises of life, engines, ropes, footsteps, but beneath it all was that deeper rhythm, the steady exhale of the sea. It was the same sound he'd heard as a young man, the same one that had followed him across decades. He closed his eyes. For a moment he was back there, the storm overhead, the cable singing, the chamber descending. He felt the weight of it again, the air thinning, the silence thickening until it became something solid. But this time, the silence didn't press. It lifted. It wrapped around him like a tide. The price of silence was never despair. It was memory. It was carrying the ocean inside you and learning to live with its stillness. As the night deepened and the stars came out over the calm harbor, Momsen turned away from the water and began the slow walk home. Behind him, the sailfish lay at rest, her decks empty, her duty complete. The waves lapped gently at her hull as if in conversation. The deep had claimed its share and given back what it could. The rest belonged to silence.
The years rolled onward, until even the stories began to fade into the soft grain of history. The men who had lived them grew old, their voices lowering, their hands slower. Time softened the sharp edges of memory, but the sea stayed the same, indifferent, immense, a mirror that never truly reflected what it had seen. The sailfish was decommissioned quietly, her decks stripped, her nameplate removed and polished for display. In the museum's light, she looked smaller than she ever had at sea, like a creature asleep, her strength folded in on itself. Visitors came to see her out of curiosity more than reverence, but every so often one would stand a little longer before her plaque, whispering the words aloud. Squalus, May 1939, 33 saved. Momsen lived long enough to see the rescue chamber he had built replaced by newer ones, sleeker, faster, but built on the same principles. He saw submarines dive deeper than anyone had thought possible, steel shaped to withstand pressures that would crush the human body in an instant. He saw astronauts train in water, practicing in the same element that had once nearly taken everything from him. Sometimes, when he was invited to speak at ceremonies, he would stand behind the podium and look out at the faces of men and women who now worked not only beneath the sea, but beyond the sky. He always said the same thing. The laws are the same: pressure, patience, and the courage to listen. When he retired for the last time, he left the coast behind and moved inland, but he never lived far from water. A small lake behind his home caught the sunrise each morning, and he would sit by it with a cup of coffee, the air still and cool. On quiet days, when the surface lay perfectly flat, he could almost see the Atlantic there, the same shifting reflections of clouds and sky. He would think of the men who had waited at the bottom, of the sound of the cable unspooling, of the moment the chamber had sealed and begun to rise. He never spoke of it as heroism. He spoke of it as work done carefully, the way any craftsman might describe the making of something that mattered. The world moved on without him, as worlds do. Submarines became faster. Their shapes changed. Their missions reached farther. But every dive still began with the same pause, the same intake of breath before the descent, the same respect for the deep that had been learned in those first days of rescue. In training manuals, in classrooms, the diagrams of his old chamber were still printed, labeled, studied. The men and women reading them might not know his voice, but they knew his lesson. The sea, they were taught, does not forgive carelessness, but it rewards attention. That was his gift to them. When he passed, it was in his sleep, quietly, the way a tide leaves the shore. The Navy gave him honors, a folded flag, a few words spoken over the sound of waves. His ashes were scattered offshore, not far from where the Squalus had gone down all those years ago. The boat was gone now too, broken and reclaimed by silt, but the water still held its outline. As the ashes touched the surface, they swirled for a moment, catching the light, then fell and vanished. The sea accepted them without ceremony, as it accepts everything. In the deep, there is no sense of time. The cold water moves over wrecks and stones, over cables and shells, over the small, enduring fragments of human will. Down there, the remains of the Squalus rest quiet, her ribs half buried, her shape softened by the slow work of years. Fish drift through her open hatches. Sunlight filters down in faint threads. What was once tragedy has become part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the rest of the ocean's memory. If one listens closely, if one could listen at all, the deep hums with what remains of voices and breath, the echoes of men who refuse to surrender. The pressure that once threatened to destroy them now holds them gently. A silence so vast it almost feels like peace. Above, on the surface, ships still pass, their wakes spreading in bright arcs. Divers descend on training missions, unaware of how close they swim to the old wreck. They carry with them the devices that trace their lineage back to that single desperate rescue. Air systems refined from the first lungs, cables engineered from the lessons learned when steel bent and held. The legacy lives not as monument, but as practice, in the precision of their movements, the trust between a crew and their vessel, the knowledge that fear is not the enemy, but the signal to act carefully. The ocean gives no endings, only continuations. The story of the Squalus did not end with her rescue, or her renaming, or even her final silence on the seafloor. It continues every time a diver checks a gauge, every time a submarine slips beneath the horizon, every time a sailor looks down into dark water and feels awe instead of dread. It continues in the simple truth that the human spirit, like the sea, is shaped by pressure, but not destroyed by it. Some nights, when the moon is full and the Atlantic lies still, the water above her resting place glows faintly, a sheen of silver rolling with the tide. Fishermen say it's just reflection, the play of light on current. But those who know the story say it's something else. The ocean remembering, paying quiet respect to the men who once defied its depths and to the one who taught it that mercy could be engineered. The glow fades by dawn, leaving only the calm, endless expanse, its surface smooth as glass. Far below, the sea holds its breath, the pressure constant, the silence unbroken. Yet within that silence lives everything: courage, invention, sacrifice, endurance. The eternal depth is not the measure of water, but of will, the distance between despair and the first act of hope. In that space, men once knocked on a hatch, waited, and rose again toward the light. And the ocean, ancient and infinite, still remembers the sound.